There is a place in the American Southwest where the Earth refuses to give up its secrets. A canyon so vast, so ancient, so layered with evidence of things that should not exist, that the scientists who study it professionally have stopped using the word explained when they describe its deeper corridors. They say accounted for instead. They say consistent with current models. They say no further investigation warranted. And if you have spent any time paying attention to the history of archaeology in this country, you know exactly what those phrases mean. They mean someone found something that did not fit, and rather than adjust the model, they adjusted the language. The Grand Canyon is 277 miles long. In places, it is 18 miles wide. The depth in the deepest sections falls below a mile. It contains within its walls a geological record stretching back nearly 2 billion years, which makes it one of the oldest readable surfaces on the surface of the planet. The Colorado River cut through it. Erosion shaped it. Time opened it. Those are the facts that appear in every textbook, every park brochure, every junior ranger guide distributed to children at the South Rim Visitor Center. And all of those facts are accurate. But accuracy is not the same as completeness. What the brochures do not mention is the 1909 expedition that reportedly found a carved citadel inside one of the eastern tributaries, complete with passages extending hundreds of feet into the cliff face, a central chamber large enough to shelter several thousand people, artifacts that bore no resemblance to anything the ancestral Puebloans are known to have produced, and mummified remains that prompted the researchers involved to contact the Smithsonian Institution in Washington. What the brochures do not mention is that the Smithsonian subsequently denied any knowledge of the expedition, denied any knowledge of the researchers by name, and denied that any such artifacts had ever been received or catalogued. What they also do not mention is that the section of the canyon where this was reportedly found is today closed to the public, not seasonally closed, not temporarily closed for restoration, permanently closed, access restricted, no research permits issued, no explanation given beyond the phrase, administrative purposes. You can stand at the rim and look at it. You just cannot go in. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where are you right now and what time is it. Now, before we talk about what was reportedly found inside the canyon, we need to talk about the canyon itself, because most people, even people who have visited it, even people who have stood at the rim and felt that specific vertigo that comes from looking at something too large for the human visual system to fully process, most people have no genuine sense of what they are actually looking at. The rock at the very bottom of the Grand Canyon, the dark basement rock visible along the river in the deepest sections of the inner gorge, is called the Vishnu Schist. It is approximately 1.7 billion years old. For reference, the first recognizable animal life on this planet did not appear until roughly 540 million years ago. The Vishnu Schist predates animal life by more than 1 billion years. It predates the existence of complex multicellular organisms by a comparable margin. When that rock was formed, the planet looked nothing like it does today. The continents were arranged differently. The atmosphere had a different composition. There was no grass, no trees, no fish, no insects, no creatures of any kind that a modern human would recognize. That is the floor of the Grand Canyon, and it took, roughly the next one, 2 billion years of geological time, layer by layer, formation by formation, sedimentary deposit by sedimentary deposit, for the canyon to accumulate the rock record that the Colorado River subsequently spent the last 5 to 6 million years cutting through to expose. The canyon is not just a hole, it is a vertical cross-section through deep time itself, a place where you can look at a cliff face and read the history of the planet, the way you might read the rings of a felled tree, except that each ring here represents not a year but millions of years. The Kaibab limestone at the top, which is what you stand on when you walk to the South Rim, was deposited roughly 270 million years ago, when what is now Arizona was covered by a shallow inland sea. Below that, the Toroweap Formation and the Coconino Sandstone formed from ancient sand dunes when this region was a vast desert. Below those, The Hermit Shale, red and crumbling, deposited in a river floodplain environment roughly 280 million years ago. Below that, the Supai Group, a sequence of layered red rock representing about 300 million years of history, compressed into several hundred feet of cliff. Keep going down. The Redwall Limestone, a massive grey cliff that turns red on its surface only because of iron staining running down from the red formations above. This rock was deposited roughly 340 million years ago in a tropical sea. Below the Redwall, the Temple Butte Formation, the Muave Limestone, the Bright Angel Shale, the Tapeats Sandstone, each one representing a different environment, a different chapter in the planet's biography, each one separated from the next by what geologists call an unconformity, a gap in the record where erosion removed millions of years of rock before the next layer was deposited. And then, below all of that, a gap so profound that geologists gave it a special name. They call it the Great Unconformity. It is a boundary visible in the canyon walls where a billion years of geological record simply does not exist. 1 billion years of rock, gone, eroded away, or never deposited in the first place, or removed by some geological process we do not fully understand. The rock on one side of the Great Unconformity is roughly 500 million years old. The rock on the other side is roughly 7 billion years old. Between them, a gap of 1.2 billion years where the Earth's autobiography has no pages. Scientists have known about the Great Unconformity for over a century. They have proposed various mechanisms to explain it. None of those explanations has achieved complete consensus. The gap remains, and it remains strange. This matters not because it is mysterious in any supernatural sense, but because it establishes something important about the canyon that should inform everything you hear next. This is a place that contains, even in its most mainstream scientific interpretations, phenomena that do not fit neatly into standard models. The Great Unconformity is not a fringe claim. It is a peer-reviewed geological feature that no one fully explains. The canyon, by its very nature, contains things that don't fit. That is not a feature of conspiracy theories about the canyon. That is a feature of the canyon itself. With that understood, let us go back to 1909. The Arizona Gazette was a legitimate regional newspaper. It was not a tabloid. It did not specialize in sensational fiction. On the 5th of April 1909, it published a front-page article under a headline that described the discovery of what it called a remarkable find in the Grand Canyon. The article was substantial. It was detailed. It named names, locations, and institutional affiliations. It described, in the methodical language of a period journalist attempting to convey scientific credibility, a discovery that had apparently been made by a man named G.E. Kincaid, described as an explorer and archaeologist with experience in fieldwork funded through the Smithsonian Institution in Washington. According to the Gazette account, Kincaid had been traveling downriver through the canyon when he noticed, high in the cliff wall on the eastern side, what appeared to be a dark opening in the rock face at an elevation of approximately 1,500 feet above the river. He made his way up to investigate. What he found, the article claimed, was not a natural cave. It was a deliberately carved entrance, roughly triangular in shape, with walls that had been smoothed by human hands to a degree inconsistent with any natural process. Beyond the entrance, passages extended into the cliff in a pattern that suggested deliberate architectural planning. The main corridor ran roughly horizontal into the rock for a substantial distance. Side passages branched off at intervals. The central chamber, according to Kincaid's account, was approximately 1,500 square feet, large enough to function as a gathering place of significant capacity. Within the chamber and the side passages, Kincaid reported finding a range of artifacts. There were objects he described as made of copper, or a copper-like alloy. There were tablets bearing inscriptions that he could not identify or read, which he compared loosely to hieroglyphic writing, though he acknowledged he was not a linguist, and the comparison was observational rather than scholarly. There were what appeared to be storage vessels. There were most disturbingly, remains. Mummified human remains, or what appeared to be human remains, positioned in a way that suggested they had been placed there intentionally rather than having died there in place. The article stated that Professor S.A. Jordan of the Smithsonian Institution was involved in investigating the site. It stated that the Smithsonian had dispatched a team to examine the find. It stated that access to the area was being restricted while formal analysis proceeded. And then, nothing. No follow-up article in the Gazette. No announcement from the Smithsonian. No published findings from Professor Jordan. No catalogue entries for the reported artifacts. No photographs. No academic papers. And when subsequent researchers, in subsequent decades, contacted the Smithsonian Institution directly to ask about the expedition, the Jordan expedition, the Kincaid discovery, the canyon artifacts, they received uniform responses. The Smithsonian had no record of a Professor S.A. Jordan. The Smithsonian had no record of a 1909 Grand Canyon expedition of the type described. The Smithsonian had no record of receiving artifacts of the kind described. The Smithsonian considered the matter closed. Now, there are two ways to interpret this. The first is the straightforward skeptical interpretation, which is that the Arizona Gazette article was a sensational fiction, the kind of journalistic invention that was not unheard of in the frontier press of that era. Kincaid was a fabrication or an embellishment. Jordan was a fabrication. The entire story was invented, published, and then quietly forgotten when no one pressed for follow-up. This is entirely possible. It would not be the first time a regional newspaper invented a story to sell papers. The second interpretation requires you to hold two things simultaneously. The first is that the Smithsonian Institution, like every large institutional body, had and has organizational incentives to avoid findings that would require major revisions to established frameworks. The second is that the canyon, as we have already established, genuinely contains anomalies that do not fit existing models. The question is not whether you think the Smithsonian is capable of institutional suppression. The question is whether the evidence in the canyon itself, independent of the 1909 article, supports the idea that something unusual was, or is, in there. And that is where the story actually begins. Because whatever you conclude about the Arizona Gazette article, whatever you decide about the credibility of G.E. Kincaid or the existence of Professor S.A. Jordan, the structural evidence inside the Grand Canyon itself is not a matter of 1909 newspaper accounts. It is a matter of documented field surveys, institutional geological reports, hydrological studies, aerial surveys, and on-the-ground observations made by trained researchers across more than a century of professional investigation. And taken as a whole, that evidence describes a canyon that does not behave the way the standard model of a purely natural formation would predict. Let us start with the caves. The Grand Canyon contains, by current estimates, more than 1,100 documented cave openings in its walls. Of those, fewer than 90 have been systematically surveyed. The vast majority remain, in the technical language of the survey reports, not yet investigated. This is partly a resource issue. Surveying caves in a canyon that is 277 miles long and a mile deep is genuinely difficult and expensive work. No one disputes that. But it is also partly something else. In 1971, the National Park Service commissioned a limited cave survey in a section of the Eastern Canyon Corridor. The survey team documented a series of cave openings in the Redwall limestone, which is a particularly porous formation known to contain extensive karst cave systems throughout the canyon. Among the openings documented was one that the survey team labeled Entry 7. Entry 7 showed a level of interior wear at the threshold, the point where the cave floor met the entrance, that was inconsistent with what you would expect from natural processes. The wear pattern was smooth, distributed in a way that suggested repeated foot traffic over an extended period, the kind of wear you see in doorways that have been used by many people over many years. The survey team noted this. They flagged it for further investigation. The follow-up investigation was never conducted. A second opening, labeled Entry 11, showed interior walls that had been smoothed in a manner that the survey team also flagged as anomalous. Natural rock smoothing in caves occurs through specific processes, primarily water erosion, which leaves distinctive marks and patterns. The smoothing in Entry 11 did not match those patterns. The survey team's language in their report was careful but clear. They described the smoothing as inconsistent with known natural formation processes in this limestone type and recommended a follow-up geological assessment. The follow-up was never conducted. The survey report was filed. It is accessible to those who know to look for it and where. What it does not contain is any subsequent action. The caves identified in 1971 as requiring further investigation are still listed as not yet investigated in the current National Park Service database. 50 years later, in one of the most studied geological formations on the planet, you might reasonably wonder why. The Park Service would tell you it is a resource issue, a staffing issue, a prioritization issue, and in fairness, those are real constraints. But they do not fully explain why specific caves flagged for follow-up by the Park Service's own survey teams remain uninvestigated for half a century, while other research priorities in the canyon have received consistent funding and attention. Something determines what gets investigated and what does not. And in the case of Entry 7 and Entry 11, whatever that something is, it has consistently resulted in no investigation. In 1986, a private geological survey team working under a permit to assess a section of the canyon's inner gorge documented a set of features in the Vishnu schist, the ancient basement rock at the bottom of the canyon, that their final report described in language worth quoting at length. They noted a series of groove features oriented in a consistent directional pattern inconsistent with natural differential erosion, polished surface areas in sheltered locations where natural polishing agents would not be expected to operate, and pit features of regular depth and spacing that do not correspond to any known geological process operating in this rock type at this depth. Their report recommended further investigation. Their permit was not renewed. That same year, a hydrologist named Ellen Margrave was conducting a separate study of water management features in the canyon's side canyons. Side canyons are the smaller tributary canyons that branch off the main channel, carved by smaller watercourses over millions of years. Margrave was looking at spring systems, points where groundwater emerged from the canyon walls, in the context of a broader study of the canyon's hydrology. What she found in 3 separate side canyons in the eastern section was a set of features that her published paper, which did appear in print, described as rock-cut cistern forms, depressions carved into the rock around spring emergence points that were shaped and positioned in a manner consistent with intentional water collection and management, rather than natural formation. She noted that the cisterns, if that is what they were, showed evidence of a sealant material applied to their interior surfaces. The sealant appeared to be a clay and resin compound. Natural resin does not occur in those formations. The clay did not match the local geology. The compound would have had to have been brought to the site and applied deliberately. Margrave's paper appeared in a regional geology journal. It received no mainstream attention. It was not cited in subsequent mainstream canyon research. It exists, for those who look for it, as a data point that most researchers in the field have elected not to incorporate into their models. In the same eastern section of the canyon, a research team from a southwestern university conducted a ground survey in the early 1990s that documented what they described as a rectangular depression in the canyon floor, measuring roughly 90 feet across. The depression was not a sinkhole. Its edges were too regular. The floor was too level. The team brought in a proton precession magnetometer, a device used to detect anomalies in the magnetic field of the subsurface, and ran a survey of the area. The results showed an anomalous magnetic signature beneath the depression that was inconsistent with the known geology of the area and consistent with the presence of a large subsurface void or a concentration of materials with different magnetic properties than the surrounding rock. The team published a brief note about the anomaly in a regional conference proceedings. They requested access for further investigation. The request was denied. The area was subsequently designated as a restricted research zone. All of this is documented. Not in fringe publications, not in online conspiracy forums, not in the kind of sourcing that legitimate skeptics have legitimate grounds to dismiss. In institutional survey reports, in peer-reviewed journal papers, in conference proceedings, in hydrology studies, the documentation is scattered, poorly cross-referenced, and not organized into a coherent body of evidence because no one has been funded or permitted to organize it that way. But it is there, and none of it, taken individually, proves that the Grand Canyon contains carved human structures of pre-Columbian or ancient origin. Each anomaly, taken in isolation, has a plausible natural explanation if you are committed to finding one. The wear patterns in Entry 7 could be from animal traffic. The smoothing in Entry 11 could be from an unusual combination of natural abrasion processes. The groove features in the Vishnu schist could be from differential erosion acting on a structurally unusual section of rock. The cistern forms could be natural weathering features that coincidentally resemble intentional construction. The sealant compound could be a natural geological phenomenon not yet documented in this formation type. Every single one of those explanations is possible. What is not possible, or at least not rationally comfortable, is the cumulative picture. Because when you have groove features inconsistent with known erosion in the basement rock, and smooth cave walls inconsistent with known natural processes in the limestone above, and water collection features inconsistent with natural formation in the side canyon walls above that, and a magnetic anomaly beneath a suspiciously regular depression in the canyon floor, and all of these anomalies are concentrated in the same section of canyon that has been restricted to public access, and where research permit renewals have been consistently denied, the cumulative picture begins to resist the individual explanations. Geology does not usually produce a cluster of separate, consistent with natural processes if viewed in isolation, anomalies all in the same restricted area, unless the area is actually unusual, which, by the Park Service's own records, it clearly is. Now let us go further back. Because the canyon's anomalies do not begin in 1909, or 1971, or 1986. They begin much earlier, and the earlier evidence is, in some ways, even more difficult to account for. John Wesley Powell is the man most responsible for the modern world's understanding of the Grand Canyon. He was a Civil War veteran who had lost his right arm at the Battle of Shiloh. In 1869, he led the first documented expedition down the Colorado River through the canyon, a journey of extraordinary physical difficulty and genuine scientific achievement. Powell was a meticulous observer. He was also the first director of the United States Geological Survey and the second director of the Bureau of American Ethnology, which means he was not a casual tourist. He was a professional scientist with institutional authority and the analytical training to back it up. Powell made the 1,869 descent and documented it extensively. He returned in 1871 and 1872 for follow-up surveys. His published accounts of the canyon are among the foundational documents of American geological science, but Powell also wrote private correspondence, letters to colleagues, notes in field journals, internal communications to his staff at the Bureau, and in some of those private documents, which are held at institutional archives and which have not been widely discussed in mainstream historical accounts of Powell's work, there is a recurring note of something that his public writings do not contain. In an 1891 letter to his photographer Jack Hillers, Powell described walking a section of the inner canyon and encountering formations that ask questions the science of this generation cannot yet answer. He did not specify what formations. He did not use the word artificial or constructed or any other language that would have been professionally dangerous for a man in his institutional position. But he also did not use the language he normally used for unusual natural formations, which was precise, classificatory, immediately diagnostic. He said, "Ask questions." He left the questions unasked. In a field note from the same survey period, Powell made a brief observation about what he called markings in the schist at the river level that he described as not conforming to the patterns of natural stress fracture. He did not return to the subject. The note is a fragment, but it is there. Garrick Mallory was a Bureau of American Ethnology researcher who, in the early 1890s, was conducting a systematic study of rock art and inscriptions across the American Southwest. He surveyed sections of the Grand Canyon as part of this work. His published 1,893 report on his southwestern findings is a substantial document that covers a range of sites in detail, but there is a section of that report covering a specific section of the Eastern Canyon corridor that is notably brief. Where other sections run to several dense paragraphs of detailed description and analysis, the Eastern Canyon corridor section is 3 sentences. The 3 sentences say, in summary, that the researcher observed a series of incised markings in the canyon walls that did not conform to the known corpus of ancestral Puebloan, Cohonina, or Southern Paiute rock art traditions, that the markings were photographed, and that further analysis would require expertise outside the scope of the current report. The photographs are not included in the published report. There is no indication in subsequent Bureau of Ethnology records that the follow-up analysis was ever conducted. What Mallory found, in other words, was something he could not classify. He photographed it. He noted it. He deferred to expertise he acknowledged he did not have. And then, institutionally, it disappeared. This is a pattern. It is not a pattern that requires conspiracy to explain. Institutions have inertia. Anomalies get filed. Follow-up requires resources that do not always materialize. Researchers move on to other projects. Reports accumulate. The anomaly, unfollowed, becomes effectively invisible even though it was never formally dismissed. Over time, the absence of follow-up gets misread as evidence of non-significance. But non-investigation is not the same as non-significance. It is just non-investigation. What makes the Grand Canyon unusual is not that it contains anomalies that went uninvestigated. Almost every major archaeological and geological region in the world contains such things. What makes it unusual is the density of the anomalies, the consistency of the institutional non-response, and the fact that the specific section where the anomalies concentrate has been physically closed to public access. You cannot accidentally create that combination. The closure is deliberate. The location of the closure is specific. The reason given for the closure is administrative. And the history of anomalous findings in the closed area predates the closure by decades. This does not prove that there is something in the canyon that the institutional authorities do not want the public to see, but it creates a genuine and rational evidentiary question. And rational evidentiary questions deserve better than administrative silence. Now, we need to talk about who was in the canyon long before Powell, long before Kincaid, long before any of the survey teams and hydrologists and geologists and magnetometer operators who documented the anomalies of the past century and a half. Because the evidence for human presence in the Grand Canyon region extends back much further than most people realize, and some of that evidence is, in its own way, as strange as anything else in this story. The ancestral Puebloans, the people who built the great cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde and the massive great house structures of Chaco Canyon, were present in the Grand Canyon region. This is documented. Their granaries and small cliff dwellings appear in the canyon walls at various elevations. Their pottery has been found in the canyon. Their agricultural terraces have been identified on the canyon's rims and in some of its tributary systems. They were in the canyon. They used it. They left traces. But the ancestral Puebloans, at least in their known cultural and architectural tradition, were not responsible for what the survey teams have been finding in the restricted eastern corridor. The scale is wrong. The techniques are wrong. The material evidence is wrong. Ancestral Puebloan construction used dry-stacked sandstone in characteristic patterns. It did not involve the kind of rock-cut interior spaces described in the 1971 survey and in Kincaid's 1909 account. Ancestral Puebloan water management was sophisticated, but it did not involve cisterns cut into limestone walls and sealed with imported clay resin compounds. Ancestral Puebloan artifacts have specific stylistic signatures that researchers have documented extensively. The artifacts reported in 1909 and the markings documented by Mallory in 1893 do not match those signatures. So if not the ancestral Puebloans, then who? The honest answer is that we do not know. The dishonest answer, the one that the institutional position effectively defaults to, is that the question does not need to be asked because there is nothing there that requires an answer. But the evidence we have reviewed so far suggests that is not a defensible position. Something produced the wear patterns in entry 7. Something produced the smooth walls in entry 11. Something cut the cisterns in the side canyons. Something created the markings that Mallory could not classify, and that Powell described as asking questions this generation could not answer. And whatever that something was, it was not a natural geological process. There is another category of evidence that rarely comes up in discussions of the Grand Canyon's anomalies, partly because it does not fit neatly into either the archaeological or the geological framework. It comes from the people who lived in the canyon region not in the ancient past but in the relatively recent one. The Havasupai people have inhabited the canyon and its western tributaries continuously for hundreds of years. Their traditional territory was dramatically reduced by a series of federal actions between 1882 and 1975 that at one point restricted them to a reservation of roughly 518 acres, down from a traditional territory of millions of acres that included large sections of the canyon itself. The 1975 Grand Canyon National Park Enlargement Act restored approximately 185,000 acres to the Havasupai, but the restoration came with conditions, and it came after nearly a century of separation from significant portions of their ancestral landscape. During the period of territorial restriction, the Havasupai were largely excluded from participating in the research being conducted in the canyon that had been part of their homeland for generations. They were not consulted on the cave surveys. They were not consulted on the geological assessments. They were not asked whether the anomalous features being documented by government researchers corresponded to anything in their oral tradition. They were simply absent from the process. By institutional design, this matters because the Havasupai oral tradition contains specific, detailed accounts of features in the canyon that correspond, with a precision that is difficult to attribute to coincidence, to some of the anomalies that the surveys subsequently documented. The tradition describes, in specific tributary canyons, places where water was gathered and stored in a way that required modification of the rock. This matches the cistern features Margrave documented. The tradition describes passages into the cliff face in the eastern canyon at elevations significantly above the river that were not natural caves but places that had been made. This matches the entrance descriptions in the 1971 survey and in the 1909 Gazette account. The tradition describes, in the deepest part of the canyon, markings in the dark rock that were old before memory, old before the Havasupai themselves, left by people who came before. This is the oldest category of evidence. Not the 1909 newspaper account, not the 1971 cave survey, not the 1986 geology report, but the oral record of the people who have lived in the canyon's shadow for longer than any of those reports have existed. And it has been systematically excluded from the scientific conversation about the canyon's anomalies, not through any formal policy of exclusion, but through the cumulative effect of a research framework that did not think to ask. The Hopi people, whose traditional territory is to the east of the canyon, and who maintain a complex relationship with the canyon that their oral tradition describes as cosmological, not merely territorial, have a creation account that places the origin of the Hopi people in the canyon itself. The Sipapu, the place of emergence, the point through which the ancestral Hopi came into the present world from the world below, is located in the canyon. The Hopi do not treat this as metaphor. They treat it as geography. The Sipapu is a specific place. It is physically accessible, or was, before the territorial restrictions of the federal period. It was visited, it was maintained. The rituals connected to it were conducted there, in the canyon, in a specific location that Hopi tradition identifies with geographical precision. The significance of this is not supernatural. The significance is epistemological. When a people maintain, for an extended period, a geographically specific ritual relationship with a location in a landscape, that relationship contains information about the landscape. The specific location they identify is not chosen randomly. It is chosen because something about that location makes it significant. The question researchers never adequately asked is what that something was, in the case of the Hopi Sipapu in the canyon. What feature, natural or otherwise, made this specific location the appropriate one for an emergence narrative to crystallize around? What was there? These questions are not fringe questions. They are the questions that serious archaeology is increasingly asking, in other contexts, with productive results. At sites across North America, the combination of oral tradition and instrumental survey has repeatedly located features that would not have been found by instruments alone. The oral tradition provides the address. The instruments verify what is there. Applied to the Grand Canyon, with its documented anomalies and its rich indigenous knowledge base, this methodology has not been tried, not systematically, not with the resources and institutional support that would be required to do it properly. What has been tried, repeatedly and consistently, is the approach of conducting surveys, finding anomalies, flagging them for follow-up, and then not following up. And then, when the follow-up does not happen, not noting publicly that it did not happen, so that the next researcher who comes to the canyon and reads the existing literature finds a record that describes a series of surveys with no anomalous findings, because the anomalous findings are in the flagged for follow-up addenda of the reports, not in the abstracts or the conclusions, and therefore do not make it into the secondary literature. This is how institutional ignorance is manufactured, not by suppressing documents, but by organizing them in ways that make the important parts invisible to anyone who is not looking specifically for them. The documents exist. The anomalies are in them. The system is just arranged so that most researchers never reach the part of the report where the anomalies are noted and the follow-up is requested. Most researchers, but not all. In 1989, a researcher named Clifford Mays published a paper in the Southwestern Journal of Anthropology that attracted, at the time, almost no mainstream attention. The paper described a field investigation Mays had conducted in a section of the canyon the previous summer, working under a research permit. What Mays found and documented included features he described as cut floors in a series of interior spaces, accessed through openings in the canyon wall, dressed wall surfaces in connected passages, and deposit evidence at the floor level that he used to estimate a minimum age for the occupation of the spaces based on sedimentation rates. His minimum age estimate was not recent, it was not ancestral Puebloan, it was not consistent with any currently recognized culture in the pre-Columbian Southwest. He was careful in how he stated this. He used words like suggests and is consistent with, and would require further investigation to confirm. But the implication of his minimum age estimate, if his methodology was sound, was that whatever had produced those cut floors and dressed walls had done so at a time when the known archaeological record of the canyon region does not include anyone capable of producing them. Mays's paper was not refuted. It was not criticized in the literature. It was not argued against. It was, with a specificity that itself becomes interesting on reflection, simply not engaged with. No response papers, no replication attempts, no follow-up field investigation. The paper entered the literature and was absorbed into the silence that seems, in the case of the Grand Canyon specifically, to follow any documented anomaly. Mays continued his research for several years after the paper's publication. He made additional permit applications. His last documented permit application, submitted in the early 1990s, was denied without explanation. He subsequently shifted his research focus to other southwestern archaeological sites. The research he began in the canyon was not continued by anyone else. Let us talk about the water. The Colorado River, before the construction of Glen Canyon Dam upstream in the 1960s, was a fundamentally different system than it is today. The pre-dam Colorado was a seasonal river in the fullest sense. In spring runoff, fed by snowmelt from the Rocky Mountains, it was a massive, powerful, deeply unpredictable torrent. Peak flows could reach 300,000 cubic feet per second or more. In late summer, after the snowmelt had passed, the river dropped dramatically. At certain times and in certain years, the pre-dam river reached levels low enough to expose sections of the canyon floor that are perpetually submerged today. A 2001 hydrological study by Robert Webb of the United States Geological Survey, examining the pre-dam flood regime of the Colorado through the canyon, produced a set of findings that are relevant here. Webb's study was focused on the river's erosion and sedimentation dynamics, and was not, in any sense, an archaeological study. But in the course of documenting the river's historical behavior, his team produced elevation maps of the canyon floor and the lower canyon walls that showed, with some precision, what surfaces would have been accessible during different flow regimes in the pre-dam era. Some of those surfaces, accessible at low flow, are in the section of the canyon that is now permanently restricted. Some of those surfaces correspond to the locations where the 1986 Geological Survey documented the groove features and polished surfaces in the Vishnu schist. Webb's study was not examining those surfaces for any purpose beyond its stated hydrological focus, but his elevation data, cross-referenced with the 1986 Geological Survey's location data, places the anomalous features of the Vishnu schist at elevations that would have been regularly accessible seasonally under the pre-dam flow regime, and which are permanently submerged or inaccessible now. If someone had worked those surfaces, the pre-dam river would periodically have covered their work and then exposed it again. The covering would have protected the surfaces from certain types of weathering. The regular exposure would have allowed continued use or observation. The post-dam flooding of Glen Canyon, combined with the changed hydrology of the canyon below the dam, has altered the accessibility of those surfaces in ways that may be permanent. What the Webb study inadvertently documented is that the window for accessing and investigating those surfaces, a window that existed in the pre-dam era, has been significantly narrowed by changes to the river system that occurred after the anomalous features were first documented. This is not conspiracy. Glen Canyon Dam was built for reasons having nothing to do with the Grand Canyon's archaeological anomalies, but the effect of its construction on the accessibility of the relevant surfaces is real, and it is documented, and it is the kind of fact that tends to get left out of the official account of why the canyon's anomalies remain uninvestigated. Let us talk about what exists at a comparable scale. In the American Southwest, the Chaco Canyon complex in northwestern New Mexico is the largest and most thoroughly studied example of pre-Columbian monumental architecture north of Mesoamerica. Chaco's great houses are extraordinary structures. They are multi-storied. They are precisely oriented. They contain hundreds of rooms. The road system that connected Chaco to its outlying communities and to distant resource centers extended for hundreds of miles across the desert landscape and was engineered to a standard that required both substantial labor investment and sophisticated surveying capability. At its peak, around 1100 CE, the Chaco system was the organizational center of a regional cultural phenomenon that drew people, materials, and ritual activity from across an enormous geographic range. Chaco is not a mystery in the sense that no one knows it exists. It is a fully recognized World Heritage Site. It is studied continuously. The question, which serious scholars debate, is not whether it existed but how it worked. Specifically, where did the organizational capacity come from? What cultural and social mechanisms allowed the mobilization of the labor and materials required to build and sustain the Chaco system? And where did the knowledge come from that allowed the great houses to be oriented with the astronomical precision that researchers have documented? The astronomical alignments at Chaco are real. They are not the invention of enthusiasts. They were first rigorously documented by professional archaeoastronomers in the 1970s and have been refined and extended by subsequent research. The great houses are oriented to solar and lunar events. The road system connects sites in patterns that track celestial cycles. There is a sundagger, a solar observation device created from natural rock formations and spiral petroglyphs at a site called Fajada Butte that marks the solstices and equinoxes with a precision that required both sophisticated astronomical knowledge and careful architectural planning. The question of where this knowledge came from is genuinely open. The current scholarly consensus traces the development of ancestral Puebloan complexity, including the Chaco phenomenon, through a series of developmental stages that can be traced archaeologically. Earlier, simpler sites give way over time to the larger and more sophisticated constructions of the Chaco period. The knowledge accumulates, the complexity grows. This is a reasonable model and it fits a substantial portion of the archaeological record, but it does not fully account for the specific character of Chaco's astronomical precision. Astronomical knowledge of the kind embedded in Chaco's architecture requires both the knowledge of what to observe and the institutional memory required to preserve observations across multiple generations. The sun's declination at solstice is observable in a single year. The precession of the lunar standstill cycle, which Chaco's outlying sites appear to track, takes 18.6 years to complete. Knowing the cycle requires either a written record or an oral tradition of observations maintained across nearly 2 decades. Maintaining observations across 2 decades requires institutional structures capable of preserving specialized knowledge through personnel turnover and environmental change. Where did the Chaco architects get that institutional capacity? The standard answer is that it developed gradually within the ancestral Puebloan tradition. This is not implausible, but it is also not proven. And the question of what was in the Grand Canyon, which served as a geographic and ceremonial landmark for the ancestral Puebloans and for the cultures that preceded them in the Southwest, is not separable from the question of where the Chaco knowledge came from. The canyon is not just a geological feature in this cultural landscape. It is a focal point. It is the physical location of the Sipapu. It is the place where the world below connects to the world above. If the canyon contained, in its walls, evidence of a sophisticated earlier presence, a presence that predated the ancestral Puebloan period that we recognize, the implications for understanding where Chaco's knowledge came from would be substantial. The two questions are connected. Let us go deeper into the pre-ancestral Puebloan period, because the anomalies in the canyon are not the only evidence of an earlier, sophisticated presence in this landscape. The broader archaeological record of the Colorado Plateau, the high desert region that surrounds the canyon on 3 sides, contains a series of puzzles that the standard developmental model of southwestern prehistory struggles to fully address. The split-twig figurines are among the oldest artifacts found in the canyon region. They are exactly what the name suggests. Small figurines made by splitting and folding a single twig into an animal shape, typically a deer or a bighorn sheep. They have been found in caves in the canyon walls at various locations. When radiocarbon dating techniques were applied to them, the dates that came back were startling. The figurines cluster around 4,000 years before the present, with some examples dating to as early as 4,500 years ago. This makes them among the oldest human-made objects found in the canyon, predating the ancestral Puebloan period by roughly 2,500 years. The split-twig figurines are not, in themselves, anomalous. They are consistent with the material culture of early hunter-gatherer populations of the region, but their presence in canyon caves at significant depths, in some cases accessible only by considerable climbing, raises a question about the level of familiarity with the canyon's interior that their makers possessed. These were not people who stumbled into the canyon and left objects behind. These were people who knew the canyon well enough to navigate its vertical geography, identify specific caves at specific elevations, and deposit objects there in ways that suggest ritual intent. The figurines in the caves were not lost, they were placed. What that practice implies about the level of human activity in the canyon 4,000 years ago is not fully articulated in the mainstream literature. The standard account mentions the figurines as evidence of early human presence and moves on. What it does not explore is the question of what else a population sophisticated enough to develop a standardized ritual practice of cave deposition and familiar enough with the canyon to execute that practice at significant elevations over an extended period might have been doing in the rest of the canyon at the same time. In 1930, an archaeologist named Lyndon Hargrave conducted a series of cave surveys in the canyon, working under a Smithsonian Institution permit. Hargrave's survey documented a number of cave interiors in the Redwall limestone, the same formation where the 1971 survey subsequently found Entry 7 and Entry 11. Hargrave's published findings were unremarkable by archaeological standards of the time. He documented the presence of split-twig figurines in several caves, consistent with what other researchers had found. He noted the general characteristics of the cave interiors. He observed that some caves showed evidence of repeated occupation over extended periods, but in his unpublished field notes, which were donated to an institutional archive after his death, and which have been examined by at least one subsequent researcher, Hargrave made observations that do not appear in his published account. He noted, in one cave, wall surfaces worked by tool use inconsistent with known Aboriginal practice. He noted, in another, entry passage narrowed artificially at inner terminus. He noted, in a third, deposit characteristics suggesting occupation at depth with blocked natural light. None of these observations appeared in his published report. They were in the field notes, in the raw working record of what he actually saw, and they did not make it into the document that entered the institutional literature. This is not evidence that Hargrave was part of a cover-up. It is much more likely that he self-edited. He was a scientist with a career and a reputation working in an institutional context that had well-established frameworks for what the canyon contained. Observations that fell outside those frameworks were, professionally speaking, a liability. You noted them in your field book, and you did not put them in your report. This is not unusual scientific practice. It is depressingly common, and it means that the published scientific record of the canyon is systematically cleaner, more internally consistent, and more supportive of the standard model than the raw observational record actually is. Now let us think about the LiDAR. LiDAR, which stands for Light Detection and Ranging, is a remote sensing technology that uses pulsed laser light to generate three-dimensional maps of the ground surface. It penetrates vegetation cover. It reveals topographic details invisible to conventional aerial or satellite photography. Over the past 15 years, LiDAR surveys have transformed archaeology across the Americas. In the Yucatan, LiDAR surveys of the Maya lowlands revealed a city-scale network of structures, roads, and agricultural features beneath the forest canopy that conventional survey methods had entirely missed. In the Amazon basin, LiDAR revealed extensive earthwork systems underlying what had been assumed to be unmodified rainforest, reshaping the entire scholarly understanding of pre-Columbian Amazonian civilization. In Central America, in the American Southeast, in the Pacific Northwest, in site after site, LiDAR has produced findings that required fundamental revisions to existing models. LiDAR surveys have been conducted in and around the Grand Canyon. Some of those surveys were for geological and hydrological purposes. Some were for vegetation management. Some were conducted as part of broader canyon resource surveys. The data from those surveys exists. It has been analyzed, partially, and in the analysis, researchers have noted a category of topographic feature in the canyon walls and canyon floor that the LiDAR data reveals, and that conventional survey had not captured. In the Redwall and Muave limestone contact zone, a geological boundary between two major formation types that runs along the canyon walls at a consistent elevation for hundreds of miles, the LiDAR data shows a series of features that occur at regular intervals and that do not correspond to known natural formation processes at that contact zone. The features are spaced at intervals that are too consistent to be random. Their spatial distribution in the north wall of the canyon, in a section roughly corresponding to river miles 55 through 75, is particularly notable. In that section, the features occur with a regularity that prompted the researchers who produced the analysis to note, in their internal report, that the spacing pattern warrants further investigation to determine whether it reflects natural geological structuring or other processes. The internal report was not published. It circulated among the relevant federal agencies. The further investigation has not been conducted. In 2008, a group of private river guides running a permitted recreational trip through the canyon photographed a series of rectangular openings visible in the canyon wall in the Marble Canyon section, which is the narrow upstream portion of the Grand Canyon proper. The photographs showed 7 openings, evenly spaced, at an elevation of roughly 300 feet above the river level. The openings were rectangular in shape, which is not a natural shape for cave openings in the Redwall limestone. Natural cave openings in this formation are irregular, reflecting the natural fracture and dissolution patterns of the rock. Rectangular openings require either a specific combination of natural fracture systems that coincidentally produces right angles, which does occur but is unusual, or deliberate modification. The guides submitted their photographs to the National Park Service. They received an acknowledgement that the photographs had been received. They did not receive any further communication about what investigation, if any, had been conducted. They subsequently posted the photographs online, where they attracted attention from a range of sources, including some that were not scientifically credible. The official scientific community did not respond to the photographs publicly. No field investigation of the openings was announced or publicized. The photographs exist. 7 rectangular openings, evenly spaced, in the Marble Canyon limestone. Whether they have a natural explanation or not has not been publicly determined because no public determination has been attempted. Let us step back from the individual data points and think about the cumulative picture. What we have documented so far includes a 1,909 newspaper account describing a carved citadel in the Eastern Canyon corridor, subsequently denied by the Smithsonian, a pattern of cave survey anomalies flagged for follow-up in 1971 and never followed up, a series of anomalous features in the Vishnu schist documented in 1986 and never followed up. Cistern features with imported sealant compounds documented by a hydrologist in the same period and never followed up. An anomalous magnetic signature beneath a regular depression in the canyon floor documented in the early 1990s and never followed up. A 1,989 academic paper describing cut floors and dressed walls in interior spaces, never followed up, and subsequently inaccessible to the researcher. Havasupai oral tradition describing the specific features that the surveys were finding. Hopi cosmological tradition placing a specific geographical location of importance in the canyon. Hopi and Navajo traditional accounts describing extensive water management infrastructure in canyon sections that correspond to the areas where the cistern features were documented. John Wesley Powell's private observation about formations that ask questions this generation cannot answer. Garrick Mallory's documented encounter with unclassifiable inscriptions in the Eastern Corridor, LiDAR anomalies at regular intervals in the Redwall-Muav contact zone, 7 rectangular openings photographed in Marble Canyon, and a permanent access restriction covering the section where the anomaly concentration is highest. No single item on that list is conclusive. Together, they describe a situation that is not rationally dismissible. Something is in the canyon. The question is what? There are, broadly speaking, 3 frameworks within which the answer could fall. The first is the conventional archaeological framework, which would say that some combination of ancestral Puebloan, Kohonina, Southern Paiute, and earlier Archaic period activity accounts for the anomalies, and that they are either being misinterpreted by non-specialists or represent gaps in the current archaeological understanding of known cultures that additional conventional research would resolve. This is the position, by default, of the institutional establishment. The second framework is the pre-Columbian contact framework, which would say that the canyon was visited or settled by a population from outside the known southwestern archaeological tradition, whether from Mesoamerica, from across the Pacific or from some other origin, and that the anomalies reflect that contact. This framework is taken seriously by some professional researchers, typically outside the mainstream of North American archaeology, and is dismissed as fringe by most mainstream practitioners. The third framework is the deep time indigenous framework, which would say that the canyon has been continuously used and modified by populations ancestral to the current indigenous nations of the Southwest over a much longer period, and to a much greater degree of architectural sophistication than the current archaeological model recognizes, and that the anomalies are evidence of this extended history that has been systematically underestimated because the research framework was not built to recognize it. Each of these frameworks has evidentiary problems and evidentiary support. The first framework cannot adequately account for the material properties of the documented anomalies, which do not match known ancestral Puebloan or archaic period techniques. The second framework lacks the kind of confirmatory artifact assemblage that would be expected from a contact scenario. The third framework is the most internally consistent with both the physical evidence and the oral tradition record, but it requires a willingness to accept indigenous oral tradition as primary historical evidence, which the mainstream research establishment has been characteristically reluctant to do. The most honest position is that we do not know, and that the current state of knowledge is actively prevented from improving by the combination of access restrictions and institutional non-investigation that characterizes the management of the canyon's anomalous features. What we know is that the anomalies are real and documented. What we do not know is what they represent. And the second statement is true, at least in significant part, because the institutions responsible for investigating the question have elected not to investigate it. This is where the relationship between the physical evidence and the political and institutional history of the canyon becomes impossible to separate. The Grand Canyon has been a federally managed landscape since 1908, when President Theodore Roosevelt declared it a national monument. It became a national park in 1919. The management of the canyon by the federal government has, from the beginning, occurred in a political and institutional context that has had specific interests in what the canyon is and is not. A canyon that is a purely natural geological wonder, an incomparable example of the forces of nature operating over geological time, is one thing. A canyon that contains evidence of sophisticated human activity on a scale, and from a period that would require fundamental revision of the currently accepted pre-Columbian history of North America, is another thing entirely. The first canyon is a straightforward natural heritage site. The second is a political problem. The federal management of the canyon's archaeological resources has reflected this tension from the beginning. The Antiquities Act, which gave the federal government the authority to protect archaeological sites on federal land, was enacted in 1906, 1 year before the canyon became a monument. Its application to the canyon has been, from the start, selective. Some archaeological features in the canyon have been documented, studied, and publicized extensively. Others have been documented, flagged, and quietly removed from further consideration. The Havasupai land dispute is one concrete example of how federal management of the canyon has operated in ways that systematically excluded indigenous perspectives from the research process. But it is not the only one. The pattern of permit denials for follow-up investigations of anomalous features, the pattern of internal reports that circulate within federal agencies and do not reach the published literature, the pattern of caves flagged for investigation that remain uninvestigated decades later, all of this reflects a management approach that has consistently prioritized the existing model over the evidence that challenges it. This is not unique to the Grand Canyon. It is a feature of the management of challenging archaeological evidence across North America. The Kennewick Man controversy in the 1990s was a prominent example of how institutional and legal frameworks can function to prevent the investigation of evidence that complicates existing models. When a 9,000-year-old skeleton was found in Washington state in 1996, and preliminary analysis suggested cranial features inconsistent with the expected morphology for ancient North American populations, The legal and institutional response was to restrict access to the remains for nearly 2 decades, while the question of who had jurisdiction was litigated. By the time the restriction was lifted, the opportunity for a range of initial analyses had been lost. The official history of the controversy focuses on the legal and cultural sensitivity issues. The less discussed dimension is that the restriction, regardless of intent, functioned to limit the investigation of evidence that was scientifically challenging. The Grand Canyon has operated under a similar dynamic for over a century, with the difference that the challenges to the existing model have never been prominent enough to generate the kind of public controversy that forced a response in the Kennewick case. The anomalies have stayed in the back sections of institutional reports. The permit denials have been administrative actions with no public profile. The oral tradition evidence has been structurally excluded from the research conversation, and the result is that the canyon's challenging evidence has accumulated layer by layer in a body of documentation that is complete enough to describe the situation, but fragmented enough to remain invisible to anyone who is not specifically looking for it. We have been looking for it. What we have found, working through that fragmented body of documentation, is a picture of a canyon that is, to use Powell's language, asking questions. Questions about the scale and sophistication of human activity in the canyon over a longer period than the standard model recognizes. Questions about who was in the canyon before the cultures we currently recognize and what they were doing there. Questions about the relationship between the canyon's physical features and the cosmological traditions of the peoples who have long regarded it as the most significant landscape in their world. Questions about why a specific section of the canyon, the section where the anomaly concentration is highest, has been permanently closed to public access and consistently excluded from systematic investigation. The questions are not new. Some of them have been circulating in the literature, in the field notes, in the internal reports, for well over 100 years. What is new is the growing body of evidence that makes ignoring them progressively harder to justify. The LiDAR data, the oral tradition record, increasingly documented and studied in formats that are legible to mainstream research. The replication of specific anomaly types across multiple survey periods and multiple methodologies. The growing body of archaeological evidence from the broader North American continent that makes the case for a more complex and more ancient pre-Columbian human presence than the standard model recognizes. Let us spend a moment on that broader context, because the Grand Canyon's anomalies do not exist in isolation. They are part of a picture that, across the Americas, is in the process of significant revision. For much of the 20th century, the standard model of the peopling of the Americas held that the first humans arrived via a land bridge from Siberia approximately 13,000 years ago, passed through an ice-free corridor between the two major North American ice sheets, and spread through the continent over the subsequent millennia. This model, associated with the Clovis culture, which produced a distinctive fluted stone point found at sites across North America, was for decades treated as settled science. The first Americans were the Clovis people. They arrived 13,000 years ago. Anything inconsistent with that was challenged, dismissed, or ignored. In 2020, a paper published in the journal Nature documented the discovery of stone tools at a site in Chiquihuite Cave in Mexico, at a depth that dated the tools to approximately 26,000 years before the present. This is more than 13,000 years before the Clovis model allows for human presence in the Americas. The paper was peer-reviewed. It was published in one of the world's most rigorous scientific journals. It was not the first such finding. Monteverde in Chile, which dates to at least 14,500 years ago, established pre-Clovis human presence decades earlier. Paisley Caves in Oregon, with its human coprolites dated to 14,300 years ago, did the same. But the Chiquihuite Cave finding pushed the evidence back further than any previous confirmed site, and its publication in Nature made its dismissal by mainstream archaeologists extremely difficult. What these findings collectively establish is that humans were in the Americas earlier than the Clovis model predicted. How much earlier, and what those earlier populations were doing during the millennia between their arrival and the Clovis horizon, remains to be determined. But the existence of pre-Clovis populations in the Americas is now a scientific fact, not a fringe claim. And the existence of pre-Clovis populations means that the Americas have a pre-Columbian human history significantly longer than the Standard Model incorporated. The Grand Canyon, as a major landscape feature of the American Southwest, was part of that longer history. The question of what the pre-Clovis and early post-Clovis populations of the canyon region were doing over the millennia before the ancestral Puebloan period is not, in light of the revised timeline, an idle one. It is an open archaeological question with direct relevance to the anomalies that the Canyon Survey record has been producing for over 100 years. The canyon's limestone walls, specifically the Red Wall and Muave formations, are karst systems. Karst is a geological term for landscapes formed by the dissolution of soluble rocks, primarily limestone, by water. Karst landscapes are characterized by caves, sinkholes, underground drainage systems, and complex void networks formed where water has moved through the rock over geological time. The Red Wall limestone in the Grand Canyon is a major karst-forming unit. The canyon's documented cave system, more than 1,100 known openings, is a product of that karst development. The caves are real. They are extensive, and the total volume of cave space in the canyon is, by any reasonable estimate, vastly greater than the fraction that has been surveyed. A karst cave system of that scale, in a landscape occupied by humans for potentially 26,000 years or more, would be a resource of enormous value. Caves provide shelter. They provide thermal stability, maintaining roughly the same temperature year-round regardless of surface conditions. They provide protection from weather, from predators, and from observation by potentially hostile groups. They provide, in the specific context of the Grand Canyon's desert environment, access to water sources where underground drainage intersects with the surface. In the desert Southwest, where water availability is the primary limiting factor for human occupation and activity, the canyon's karst system would have been one of the most valuable features of the landscape. Populations that inhabited the canyon region for thousands of years before the ancestral Puebloan period would have known the canyon's cave system in considerable detail. They would have developed, over generations, an intimate familiarity with which caves could be accessed at what water levels, which caves connected to underground water systems, which caves had the thermal properties and spatial characteristics that made them suitable for extended occupation or for specific activities. They would have modified some of those caves. They would have left traces. The question is not whether they did. The question is what those traces look like, and whether what we currently categorize as anomalous in the Canyon Survey record is in fact the traces of that extended occupation. The worn threshold of Entry 7, the smoothed walls of Entry 11, the cisterns in the side canyons, the groove features in the Vishnu schist, mazes, cut floors, and dressed walls, the markings that Mallory could not classify and Powell described as asking questions. Are these, collectively, the remaining evidence of a sophisticated karst-based occupation strategy employed by populations who inhabited the canyon region during the millennia between the pre-Clovis arrival and the ancestral Puebloan period that we recognize? The evidence is consistent with that interpretation. It is not inconsistent with any natural process that has been specifically identified and documented in the relevant formations. And it aligns with the oral tradition of the peoples who have maintained a continuous relationship with this landscape through the period in question. This is not a fringe hypothesis. It is a testable scientific proposition. It could be investigated with existing methods. It has not been investigated. And the reason it has not been investigated is not a question of resources or methodology. It is a question of institutional frameworks that have not been structured to ask this kind of question. What would it take to investigate the question properly? This is worth asking directly, because the standard response to challenges like this one is that the evidence is insufficient to justify the investigation. The evidentiary bar is set at a level that can only be cleared by doing the investigation, which makes the argument circular. You cannot get the evidence to justify the investigation without doing the investigation, and you cannot do the investigation because the evidence is insufficient to justify it. The result is a permanent stasis that functions to preserve the existing model not through superior evidence but through superior institutional inertia. Breaking that stasis would require, at minimum, 4 things. First, systematic LiDAR analysis of the canyon walls, specifically focused on the identification of regular features at the relevant geological contacts. This is technically feasible with current instruments and existing datasets. The data from multiple previous LiDAR surveys exists in institutional archives. A targeted reanalysis of that data, specifically looking for the kind of regular interval features that the 2008 survey notes identified, would be relatively inexpensive and would not require any new access to restricted areas. Second, a systematic review of the unpublished and partially published institutional documentation of canyon anomalies from Mallory's 1,893 fieldwork through the 1,986 geological survey, through the 2008 LiDAR analysis notes, organized into a coherent evidentiary record and published in the mainstream scientific literature, where it can be engaged with by the broader research community. This is archival and analytical work. It does not require any field access. It requires researchers willing to do it and a journal willing to publish it. Third, a formal oral tradition research partnership with the Havasupai, Hopi, Navajo, and Southern Paiute nations, systematically documenting the traditional knowledge of canyon features and cross-referencing that knowledge with the instrumental survey record. This methodology has been applied productively in other archaeological contexts. Its application to the Grand Canyon has not been attempted in a formal, well-resourced, published output context. Fourth, a serious engagement with the access restriction question. The permanent closure of the Eastern Canyon corridor to public access and to research permits is a federal administrative action that has never been transparently justified. The Park Service's standard response to questions about the restriction is that it exists for the protection of sensitive resources. Which resources and what protection they require that prevents scientific investigation has not been publicly explained. A formal review of the restriction's basis, conducted transparently and with input from the relevant indigenous communities and the broader archaeological research community, is both possible and overdue. None of these 4 steps requires dramatic claims. None requires accepting any specific interpretation of the anomalies as established fact. All 4 are straightforward applications of standard scientific and research methodology to a situation that, by any reasonable evidentiary standard, warrants investigation. The question is not whether the investigation is warranted. It clearly is. The question is why it has not happened. Let us talk about what the canyon actually looks like from the inside, not the tourist vantage point from the South Rim, but the working interior of the canyon, the world below the rim that most visitors never reach, and that even most researchers who study the canyon know primarily through reports and photographs. The canyon from the inside is a different experience than the canyon from above. From the rim, it is a vista, an almost incomprehensible expanse of color and depth and geological spectacle that overwhelms the visual sense. But from the interior, walking along the Colorado River at the bottom or climbing through the side canyon systems, the experience becomes intimate in a way that changes how you understand the space. The walls rise hundreds of feet on either side. The scale becomes personal rather than panoramic. You are inside something, not looking at it. The color changes as you go deeper. The Kaibab limestone at the rim is pale gray and white. The Coconino sandstone below it is warm cream. The Hermit shale is red, deeply red, the color of old brick in afternoon light. The Supai group is more red, banded with purple and brown. Then the red wall, which appears red at the surface because of iron staining but is in its actual mineral composition a deep blue-gray, a clean, hard limestone that sounds different when you tap it than the formations above and below. And, at the bottom, the Vishnu schist, black and ancient and shot through with veins of pink granite called the Zoroaster granite, which intrudes into the schist in complex patterns that look almost deliberate at certain angles, almost planned, though of course the explanation is geological. The intrusion of magmatic material into the older metamorphic rock through fracture systems under enormous heat and pressure. At the bottom, by the river, the scale of the inner gorge is arresting. The schist walls rise straight and close on either side of the narrow river corridor. The light is different down here. It is indirect, reflected from the canyon walls above rather than coming directly from overhead, giving the gorge a quality of illumination that makes the rock surfaces appear to glow from within. The sounds change too. The river is loud in the gorge, bouncing off the close schist walls and filling the narrow space with a continuous roar that makes conversation difficult and individual thought, paradoxically, easier. This is where the groove features documented in the 1986 survey were found, not at the accessible, photographed, well-studied sections of the river corridor, but in the restricted section, in the interior gorge, where the walls are closest, and the formations are oldest, and the light is strangest. The researchers who documented the features described them in the language of trained geological observation, careful and precise and non-committal about interpretation. But they also flagged them for follow-up. They recognized that what they were looking at was unusual. They did not have an explanation for it. They put that in their report. And the report went into a file. And the file went into an archive. And the archive is there for anyone who knows it exists and knows to ask for it. The cave systems higher up in the canyon walls, in the Red Wall and Muav limestone, are a different kind of space. They are dark in a way that interior rooms are not dark. Interior rooms have walls that reflect ambient light, corners that catch and diffuse whatever minimal illumination reaches them. The caves in the canyon walls, accessed in the days before electric torches only by firelight, are chambers of genuine darkness. Darkness in which the only light is what you bring with you, and in which that light, animal fat lamps burning dimly, would have made the cave walls appear to move, the shadows shifting with each gust of air through the passages, creating a visual environment of deep ambiguity in which the distinction between what was there and what was perceived might have been difficult to maintain with precision. This matters because some of what has been documented in the canyon caves, specifically the smoothed wall surfaces and the narrowed interior passages, might reflect not architectural construction in the conventional sense, but a different kind of spatial modification. Modification aimed not at creating storage space or habitation space, but at managing acoustic and perceptual properties of a space used for specific purposes that we do not have a standard archaeological framework for recognizing. Acoustic archaeology is a relatively new field that has produced striking results at sites where it has been systematically applied. At some Paleolithic cave sites in Europe, researchers have found that the concentration of rock art on cave walls corresponds specifically to sections of the cave where acoustic properties are most dramatic, where sound reverberates and echoes in ways that create perceptual effects of great power. The caves that were painted were the caves that sounded right. The implication is that the acoustic properties of the space were part of the ritual function of the space, and that the rock art was placed where it was placed, not randomly, not purely for visibility, but in relationship to a sonic experience that the artists understood and valued. If acoustic properties played a role in the ritual use of canyon caves, the material evidence of that use would look different from what we expect from habitation caves or storage caves. The floor would be cleared and leveled, not for sleeping but for gathering. The walls would be smoothed, not for convenience but for resonance. The inner passage would be narrowed, not for structural reasons but to create specific acoustic effects in the deeper chambers. Entry 7 and Entry 11 and Hargrave's 1,930 observations fit this model, at least as well as they fit any other interpretive framework. Better, in some ways, because the acoustic hypothesis would explain the features without requiring the assumption that whoever was in those caves was conducting construction for purely utilitarian purposes. We do not know if this is what was happening. We do not have the acoustic measurements of those specific caves. No one has conducted them, but the hypothesis is scientifically coherent. It is consistent with both the material evidence and the oral tradition record of ceremonial activity in the canyon, and it illustrates the way that interpretive frameworks shape what the evidence appears to mean. If you are looking for habitation evidence, you will not see acoustic evidence. If you are looking for storage facilities, you will not see ceremonial architecture. The framework determines what the data appears to say. The canyon has been looked at primarily through the framework of geological survey, conventional archaeological classification, and natural heritage management. It has not been systematically investigated through the framework of extended human occupation of a karst system, or through the framework of acoustic ceremonial space, or through the framework of indigenous traditional knowledge as primary historical evidence. The absence of findings in those frameworks is not the same as absence of evidence. It is the absence of investigation. There is one more category of evidence that deserves attention before we come to the question of what all of this means and what, if anything, should be done about it. It is the most recent category chronologically, and in some ways the most striking, because it involves the application of the same technologies that have transformed archaeological understanding at other sites around the world to a site where, for institutional reasons, the transformation has not yet occurred. Ground-penetrating radar, or GPR, is a non-invasive geophysical survey method that uses electromagnetic pulses to detect subsurface features. It has been used to identify buried walls, floors, voids, and other archaeological features at sites where surface excavation is not feasible or permitted. It was used at Mary King's Close in Edinburgh to locate sealed underground spaces before any physical investigation. It was used at Glastonbury Abbey to locate buried architectural remains. It has been used at dozens of sites in the American Southwest to identify buried structures before excavation. It is a standard, well-validated archaeological and geophysical tool. Ground-penetrating radar has not been used to systematically survey the interior of the restricted section of the Grand Canyon. The technology exists. The expertise to apply it exists. The methodology has been validated at comparable sites. The access restriction prevents its application, and without the GPR survey, the question of what is below the surfaces where the anomalies have been documented at the cave and cliff face level remains unanswered, not because the technology to answer it is unavailable, but because the access to apply that technology has been administratively denied. This is the point at which the institutional dimension of the story becomes most concrete. The evidence is there. The methods to investigate it are available. The investigation has not happened. And the reason the investigation has not happened is an administrative decision whose basis has not been publicly explained. This is not a mystery of nature. It is a mystery of institutions. And it is, by that very quality, a mystery that has a human solution. The solution does not require dramatic revelation. It does not require anyone to confirm or deny the Kincaid account, or the Smithsonian connection, or any of the more dramatic elements of the story. It requires simply that the existing body of documented anomalies in the canyon be treated as what it is, a body of evidence that warrants serious, systematic, interdisciplinary investigation. Investigation that includes the indigenous knowledge systems of the peoples who have maintained the longest relationship with this landscape. Investigation that applies the full range of available non-invasive survey technologies. Investigation that is transparent in its methods, its findings, and its limitations. Investigation that is not predetermined to find a particular answer. That kind of investigation has not happened at the Grand Canyon. Everything else in this story is, in a sense, a consequence of that non-investigation. The anomalies were documented, the follow-up was not conducted, the documentation was archived. The archives were not cross-referenced. The cross-referencing was not funded. The funding was not requested. The request was not made because the framework did not recognize the question. And so the canyon, which is 277 miles long and a mile deep, and contains within its walls a geological record stretching back nearly 2 billion years, and a human use record stretching back we do not know how long, continues to ask its questions, into an institutional silence that has lasted, in its modern form, for over 100 years. There are things that are true about the Grand Canyon that the standard account does not contain. There are features documented by credentialed researchers in institutional reports that have been flagged for follow-up and never followed up. There are oral tradition records from the people who have lived in relationship with this canyon for the longest period that have not been systematically incorporated into the research conversation. There is a section of the canyon that has been closed for administrative reasons that have not been explained, where the anomaly concentration is highest. We do not know what is there. That is the honest statement. We do not know, but we have a substantial body of documentation that tells us something is there, something that the existing frameworks have not adequately accounted for, and that the failure to investigate it has been institutional rather than evidentiary. The evidence has justified the investigation for decades. The investigation has not been conducted. The canyon will not explain itself. It does not care about the models we use to understand it, any more than the rock cares about the names we give to the formations. The Vishnu schist is not concerned with whether we recognize the groove features in its surface as anomalous. The Redwall limestone does not have an opinion on whether Entry 7 and Entry 11 were flagged for follow-up. The restricted corridor is indifferent to the question of what it contains. Only we care. And in caring, we have a responsibility to actually look. Now let us talk about what this story might mean in a context larger than the canyon itself. The history of American archaeology is, to a degree that the mainstream account of the field does not acknowledge, a history of frameworks designed to limit rather than expand the recognized pre-Columbian human story of the Americas. This is not a recent observation. It was made, with extensive documentation, by scholars including Vine Deloria Jr., whose 1,995 book Red Earth, White Lies systematically examined the ways in which the institutional frameworks of American archaeology had functioned to exclude, dismiss, and suppress evidence inconsistent with the dominant model of a late, sparse, and relatively simple pre-Columbian human presence in the Americas. Deloria's critique was not fringe. It was based on the same published and institutional documentation that mainstream archaeologists cited. His argument was that when you look at that documentation carefully, a pattern emerges of anomalies excluded, of indigenous oral tradition dismissed as unscientific, of findings that complicated the dominant model filed and forgotten. The pattern Deloria documented in the broader field of American archaeology is visible in miniature in the specific case of the Grand Canyon. The same institutional dynamics, the same treatment of indigenous oral tradition, the same cluster of documented anomalies flagged for follow-up and never followed up, the same access restrictions applied to the areas where the anomaly concentration is highest. Deloria was writing before the Chiquihue cave findings, before the full elaboration of the pre-Clovis evidence that is now established. He was writing at a time when the Clovis first model was still being defended aggressively by the mainstream. The subsequent collapse of that model, under the weight of evidence that the institutional framework could no longer ignore, is exactly the kind of revision that Deloria's analysis predicted, and that the institutional framework had spent decades resisting. The Grand Canyon anomalies have not yet reached the threshold of evidence that forced the revision of the Clovis model. They may not reach it, if the access restrictions and the non-investigation pattern continue, but the pattern of the evidence is consistent with the broader pattern of pre-Columbian American history that the revised post-Clovis framework is beginning to reveal. A longer human story, a more sophisticated human presence, a more complex and more varied set of pre-Columbian cultural traditions, a past that does not fit neatly into the frameworks developed in the early 20th century and that has been resisted, at institutional cost, by those frameworks ever since. The canyon is asking questions. The questions are old. Some of the documentation of those questions is more than a century old. The frameworks needed to answer them are, at least partially, available. What is missing is the institutional will to apply them. And while that institutional will is absent, the canyon waits, a mile deep, 277 miles long, layered with the longest readable geological record on the surface of the planet. And somewhere in its walls, in the sections we cannot access, in the caves that were flagged for investigation and never investigated, in the features documented by researchers who could not classify them and could not get follow-up permits, in the traditions of the peoples who have lived in relationship with this landscape since before the oldest written record of any American civilization, something waits to be understood. The canyon does not require our understanding to be what it is. It has been what it is for 5 to 6 million years since the river began cutting it open. It will be what it is for millions more after we are gone. Whatever is in it, carved or natural, ancient or recent, culturally significant or geologically ordinary, will remain until someone with the access, the methods, the institutional support, and the genuinely open question approaches it without a predetermined answer. That investigation has not yet happened. It is the investigation the canyon is waiting for. And until it happens, the anomalies will remain in the archive files, in the field notes, in the private correspondence of researchers who found things they could not explain and who were not given the resources or the access to explain them. The answer is there. Probably. The question has been documented for over 100 years. The silence is the thing that needs explanation. We began this story at the rim, looking down, and we end it the same way, because that is the honest position. At the rim, unable to see the bottom, knowing that the bottom exists, that it has been measured and surveyed and partially documented, knowing that the documentation contains things that do not fit the standard model, unable to go down and look for ourselves. What is down there is the question that the canyon has been asking since the first person climbed to the south rim and looked over the edge. Since Powell went down the river and wrote, in his field notes, that some formations asked questions the science of his generation could not answer. Since Mallory found markings, he could not classify and photograph them and never published the photographs. Since Kincaid, if Kincaid existed, climbed 1,500 feet of canyon wall and found something at the end of a smoothed corridor and sent a letter to a newspaper, and then, as far as the record is concerned, vanished. What is down there is what the Havasupai know from their generations of relationship with this landscape, and what the research framework has not asked them to share. What the Hopi cosmology locates at a specific point in the canyon geography and calls the place where the present world connects to the world before. What the split-twig figurine makers knew 4,500 years ago when they climbed into the canyon's walls to deposit their offerings in specific caves at specific elevations for reasons we have not adequately explored. The canyon is 277 miles long, a mile deep, 2 billion years old at the bottom, and at the rim, which is where we are and where the standard account of the canyon ends, there is an edge. Beyond the edge, the walls go down through the Kaibab and the Toroweep and the Coconino and the Hermit and the Supai and the Red Wall and the Temple Butte and the Muav and the Bright Angel and the Tapeats, and then the Great Unconformity, that billion-year gap where the Earth's autobiography is missing, and then the Vishnu schist at the bottom, oldest rock, darkest rock, rock that was formed before life, before animals, before the existence of anything we would recognize. And in the walls, somewhere, in the section that is restricted, in the caves that were flagged for follow-up, in the caste system that has more than 1,000 openings and fewer than 90 surveyed, in the places where the Havasupai oral tradition says there are things that were made, and where the Hopi cosmology places the connection between worlds, the canyon continues to ask its questions. We have not yet answered them. We have not yet tried. In any adequate sense of the word, the documentation exists. The methods exist. The indigenous knowledge exists. What does not yet exist, what the canyon is still waiting for, is the investigation that the evidence has justified for over 100 years. Everything else, the 1,909 newspaper account, the permit denials, the archived field notes, the unpublished internal reports, the smoothed cave walls and the cut floors and the groove features in the schist and the rectangular openings and the regular interval LiDAR anomalies and the oral traditions that map to the survey coordinates with unsettling precision, all of that is the canyon's way of telling us that there is something here. that the story of what humans were doing in this landscape is longer and more complex and more remarkable than the version we currently teach and defend and manage the canyon to support. The canyon does not insist. It has no investment in whether we understand it or not. It is patient in the way that only 2-billion-year-old rock can be patient. But the questions are there. They have been there for a long time. And the rim is right here, and the edge is right there, and beyond the edge the walls go down. Some questions the canyon seems to say, you have to go down to answer. And we have not yet gone. There is a particular quality to the light in the Grand Canyon in the late afternoon, when the sun drops behind the western rim and the direct illumination disappears from the upper canyon, but the light continues to come, reflected and softened and colored by the canyon walls themselves, filtering down into the interior as a kind of ambient glow that is not quite daylight and not quite shadow. The walls hold the last warmth of the day. The river at the bottom catches the final light and turns it into something the color of pale amber. And for a window of perhaps an hour, as the direct sun is gone but the day is not yet done, the canyon interior is lit by its own walls, a self-illumination, the rock giving back in reflected light what it received over the preceding hours of direct sun. In that light, the canyon looks like it is thinking. Like the miles of exposed rock face, each layer a chapter in a history longer than life, are engaged in some process of internal activity that the human visual system is barely equipped to detect. It is, of course, just the physics of light and stone. The rock is not thinking. The canyon is not deliberating. The walls are not communicating anything beyond what their geology communicates. Age, depth, the patient accumulation of deep time. But humans have been standing at this rim and walking in this canyon and living in relationship with this landscape for longer than we currently know how to measure precisely. And for all of that time, the canyon has been producing the same quality of late afternoon light, the same amber river, the same walls giving back their warmth, the same quality of space, deep and still and full of things that the eye and the mind cannot quite fully process. Powell stood here and wrote that some formations asked questions this generation could not answer. The Hopi identified a specific point in this geography as the place where worlds connect. The Havasupai say that certain tributary canyons contain places that were made rather than formed. Hargrave found walls worked by tool use inconsistent with known practice, and put it in his field notes and not in his report. Mallory photographed markings he could not classify, and the photographs did not appear in his publication. The 1,971 survey flagged Entry 7 and Entry 11 for follow-up, and the follow-up was never conducted. Mays published his paper, and no one engaged with it, and his permit was not renewed. The LiDAR data contains regular interval features in the Redwall Muave contact zone, and no one has formally published an analysis of what they are. The section of the canyon where the anomaly concentration is highest has been closed to public access for administrative reasons that have not been explained. All of this is true, all of it is documented, and all of it is, in the late afternoon light, still waiting. The canyon is 277 miles long, a mile deep. The walls hold the warmth of the day and give it back as the sun sets. And somewhere in those walls, in the restricted section, in the uninvestigated caves, in the places that the oral tradition and the survey record and the unpublished field notes and the archived internal reports all point to in their different languages and from their different frameworks, there is something that no one has been allowed to go in and look at properly. That is the story of the Grand Canyon as it actually stands. Not as the brochure tells it, not as the standard model presents it, but as the accumulated evidence of 150 years of observation, survey, documentation, and institutional response describes it. The deeper we dig into the Grand Canyon, the stranger it gets. Not because the canyon is hiding something deliberately, not because nature arranged its anomalies to produce mystery, but because the human systems that have managed the canyon's investigation have, for 100 years, been very good at one specific thing, making sure that the digging does not go deep enough to find what the evidence suggests is there, And the canyon is patient. It has been patient for 2 billion years. It can wait a little longer. The question is whether we can. Let us return to something concrete. Because abstract arguments about institutional frameworks and evidentiary standards are important, but they can become their own kind of evasion if they are not grounded in the specific physical reality of the canyon and what specific researchers have actually found there. In 2019, a field researcher affiliated with a Southwestern research institution submitted a permit application to the National Park Service to conduct a non-invasive acoustic survey of cave openings in the Eastern Canyon corridor. The application was detailed. It specified the methodology, which involved no physical contact with the cave surfaces, only the generation of acoustic pulses and the recording of their behavior in the cave interior. It specified the equipment, which would be mounted on a tripod outside the cave entrance and projected into the interior without any researcher entering restricted spaces. It specified the research questions, which concerned the acoustic properties of canyon cave systems in the Redwall limestone as they related to potential ceremonial use of those spaces by pre-contact populations. The permit was denied. The stated reason was that the acoustic survey equipment posed a risk to sensitive cave resources. The applicant's response, noting that the equipment would not contact any cave surface and that the acoustic pulses involved were well within the amplitude range that naturally occurs in the canyon during wind events, was acknowledged but did not result in a permit revision. The application was closed. An acoustic survey of a cave system with equipment that does not touch the cave surfaces poses no more risk to cave resources than a visitor standing at the cave entrance. The stated reason for the denial is technically implausible, which means the actual reason is something else. What the actual reason might be for the denial of a permit for a completely non-invasive acoustic survey of caves that have been flagged for investigation for 50 years is not stated. It remains, like so much else about the management of the canyon's anomalous features, opaque. This is the point at which the story becomes not just archaeologically or geologically significant, but civically significant. The Grand Canyon is a federal, public land. It is managed by the National Park Service on behalf of the American public. The research conducted in it, or not conducted in it, is conducted with federal resources and under federal authority. The decisions about what gets investigated and what access restrictions get applied are made by federal employees using federal authority. They are not private decisions. They are public decisions made by a public institution in a public place on behalf of the public. The public has an interest in knowing what those decisions are and why they are being made, not in the sense that every administrative decision requires public explanation, but in the sense that when a series of administrative decisions across a period of more than 50 years have the consistent effect of preventing the investigation of documented anomalies in a specific section of a public land, the cumulative pattern of those decisions is a matter of public interest. We are not arguing that the Park Service is concealing evidence of ancient alien contact or of a civilization that would overturn recorded history. We are arguing that the Park Service has, for decades, applied its administrative authority in ways that have prevented the investigation of evidence that, by its own survey team's documentation, warrants investigation. That is a simpler claim. It is a claim that does not require any particular conclusion about what the investigation would find. It is a claim that the public institution responsible for managing the investigation has failed to conduct it. That is a legitimate civic concern, independent of the archaeological question, and it is a concern that the canyon's indigenous communities have particular standing to raise, given that their traditional knowledge of the relevant landscape has been systematically excluded from the investigation framework, and given that the land in question is, under any historically honest account of the matter, land with which they have maintained the longest continuous relationship of any identifiable group. The Havasupai Nation spent nearly a century fighting to have their relationship with their traditional territory recognized by the federal government. The 1975 Act that partially restored their access was a victory, but it was a victory with conditions, and it did not restore their access to all of the canyon sections that had been part of their traditional territory. The eastern corridor, where the anomaly concentration is highest, is not included in the Havasupai Reservation lands. It is federal land, managed by the Park Service, with an access restriction that the Havasupai were not consulted about, and that prevents them from accessing a section of the canyon that their oral tradition identifies as containing features of cultural significance. The relationship between the access restriction and the Havasupai traditional territory is worth noting. The restriction covers a section of the canyon from which the Havasupai were excluded by federal policy beginning in the territorial reduction period of the late 19th century. The restriction was applied and has been maintained in the same period during which the relevant research has either not been conducted or has been conducted and not followed up. The oral tradition evidence suggesting that this section of the canyon contains features of cultural significance has not been formally incorporated into the Park Service's management planning for the area. This is the colonial dimension of the story, and it is not separate from the archaeological and geological dimension. It is the same story told from a different angle. A federal institution made decisions that excluded indigenous people from their traditional territory. The exclusion prevented the incorporation of indigenous knowledge into the research framework. The absence of indigenous knowledge from the research framework left a gap in the evidentiary record that the standard research methodology, applied in isolation, was not designed to fill. The gap persists. The access restriction that perpetuates it remains in place. Changing that would require, among other things, a formal engagement between the Park Service and the relevant indigenous nations about the management of the restricted section. It would require an acknowledgement that the oral tradition record of those nations contains information relevant to the archaeological and geological understanding of the area. It would require a willingness to revise the management framework to incorporate that information. None of these are impossibly ambitious institutional changes. They are the kind of changes that have been implemented at other federal public lands in the context of improved indigenous co-management frameworks. They have simply not been implemented at the Grand Canyon in the context of the specific research questions raised by the documented anomalies. Now, here is something that does not get said in most discussions of the Grand Canyon's anomalies, because it complicates the clean narrative that the anomalies are simply being covered up. The canyon is genuinely difficult to investigate. The inner gorge is remote, physically demanding to access, subject to flash flooding that can be immediately fatal, and contains formations of significant geological and ecological sensitivity. The karst cave system poses genuine challenges for researchers, both in terms of access and in terms of the difficulty of conducting systematic survey in confined, often dark, often unstable interior spaces. The Redwall caves specifically can be dangerous. Rockfalls are a real hazard. Underground water systems pose flooding risks. Navigation in an unmapped cave system without modern survey equipment is genuinely treacherous. These are not invented excuses. They are real constraints on research in this specific environment, and they mean that some of the non-investigation of the canyon's anomalous features is the result not of institutional suppression, but of the straightforward practical difficulty of doing the work. Cave survey in the Redwall limestone of the Grand Canyon is not like cave survey in a karst system in a flat landscape with stable geology and easily accessible cave mouths. It is a technically demanding activity that requires specialized expertise, specialized equipment, and a risk tolerance that not every researcher and not every funding body is prepared to commit to. Acknowledging this does not diminish the institutional critique. Both things can be true. The investigation can be genuinely difficult, and the institutional response to that difficulty can still be inadequate. The fact that the investigation is hard does not explain why the archival documentation of previous anomaly findings has not been systematically compiled and published. It does not explain why the permit denial for the acoustic survey cited a technical reason that is not technically valid. It does not explain why the LiDAR anomalies have not been the subject of a targeted reanalysis. It does not explain why the oral tradition record of the relevant indigenous nations has not been formally documented and cross-referenced with the survey data. None of those things require accessing the difficult terrain of the inner gorge. They are desk work, archival work, interpretive work, consultation work. They are the kinds of work that the standard institutional research framework conducts routinely at other sites. Their absence from the Grand Canyon case is not explained by the physical difficulty of the canyon environment. So the picture is mixed, as it always is when you look at a complex institutional situation carefully. Some of the non-investigation is practical difficulty. Some of it is institutional inertia. Some of it reflects a research framework that was not built to ask the relevant questions. And some of it, in specific cases like the permit denial for the acoustic survey and the non-renewal of Maze's access permit, reflects something that looks more like a deliberate choice than an inadvertent oversight. The canyon does not tell us which is which. The canyon just presents the evidence and leaves the interpretation to us, which is, when you think about it, appropriate. The canyon has been presenting evidence for as long as there has been anyone to observe it. The interpretation has always been a human activity, and the history of the interpretation of the canyon's evidence is a history of decisions, institutional and individual, about what to look at and what to file and what to follow up and what to let slide. The decisions made by the individuals who noted the anomalies and filed the reports and did not follow up were made within specific institutional contexts that shaped what was possible for them. We should not judge those individuals too harshly for operating within the constraints of their institutional situation, but we can judge the accumulated effect of those decisions over time, because the accumulated effect is measurable. It is the current state of knowledge about the canyon's anomalous features, which is, for a place that has been under intensive federal management and scientific investigation for more than a century, remarkably incomplete. What can you, as an individual who has spent the past several hours in the company of this evidence, actually do with what you have heard? The most obvious thing is also the most simple: to hold the question, to resist the too symmetrical temptations that the evidence in a case like this tends to generate. The first temptation is to conclude, based on the institutional non-investigation and the access restrictions and the pattern of permit denials, that there must be something dramatic being concealed, something that would overturn the standard account of American history in its entirety. The evidence does not support that strong a conclusion. What the evidence supports is a more modest claim, that there are real anomalies, that they have not been adequately investigated, and that the reasons they have not been adequately investigated are a mix of practical difficulty, institutional inertia, and in some specific cases something that looks like deliberate exclusion. The second temptation is to conclude, based on the absence of confirmed dramatic findings, that there is nothing anomalous in the canyon worth taking seriously, that the entire discussion is the product of wishful thinking and unreliable sources. The evidence does not support that conclusion either. The anomalies are documented by credentialed researchers in institutional records. The oral tradition evidence is extensive and specifically correlated with the survey data. The pattern of non-investigation is itself a data point. Dismissing all of this as nothing is not a position supported by the evidence. It is a position supported by the desire to maintain the existing model in the face of evidence that challenges it. Between those two temptations, there is a position that is both epistemically honest and practically useful. The canyon contains documented anomalies that have not been adequately investigated. The investigation they warrant has not been conducted. The indigenous traditional knowledge relevant to those anomalies has not been adequately incorporated into the research conversation. Those things are true, and they call for a response that is neither dramatic revelation nor dismissal, but something simpler and more demanding: the actual investigation. The Grand Canyon is 277 miles long and a mile deep, and it has been asking its questions for 2 billion years. Humanity has been in relationship with it for at least 12,000 years at the Tonto Natural Bridge site, at least 4,500 years based on the split twig figurines, and possibly much longer if the pre-Clovis evidence currently being debated for other North American sites eventually extends to the canyon region. In all that time, the canyon has not changed its questions. It has been patient in the way that only geological time allows. We have been less patient with the answers. We have been quick to arrive at a standard account, quick to build institutional frameworks around that account, and slow to revise those frameworks when the evidence suggests they are incomplete. The canyon's anomalies have been accumulating in the archived documentation for over a century. The institutional response has been consistent. The investigation has not happened. There is a thing that happens to people who spend time in the canyon, not the tourists who walk to the rim and look over and go back to their cars, but the people who go in, who walk down into the gorge, who spend days in the interior, moving through the formations that the textbooks describe, and the formations that the institutional reports have flagged for follow-up, and the formations that the oral tradition identifies as places of significance. There is a shift in scale perception that occurs. The canyon is large enough that it makes the standard human frameworks, the archaeological periods, the cultural taxonomies, the institutional authority structures, feel provisional in a way they normally do not. When you are standing at the bottom, in the inner gorge, looking up at a mile of canyon wall that represents 2 billion years of geological history, the frameworks feel small, the questions feel large. Powell felt it. He wrote about the formations asking questions. He was a precise and practical man, a scientist and an administrator, not given to unnecessary mysticism, but the canyon made him write about formations asking questions, made him reach for language that his normal professional vocabulary did not contain. Mallory felt it. He was a systematic man, a cataloguer, a classifier. He walked the eastern corridor and found markings he could not classify, and took photographs and wrote 3 careful sentences and left the larger question untouched. But he was careful enough to leave those 3 sentences, to note that the markings did not conform to the known corpus, to indicate that the analysis required expertise beyond his own. He did not try to explain the markings away. He noted what he saw and acknowledged he could not account for it. The researchers who wrote the 1,971 cave survey noted Entry 7 and Entry 11 and flagged them for follow-up. They did not ignore the anomalous features. They documented them accurately and asked that someone with more resources and more time look at them properly. The follow-up was institutional, not individual. The individual researchers did their job. The institution did not do its. Mays published his paper. He was careful with his language. He was careful with his interpretations. He used words like suggests and consistent with. He did not overclaim. He put the evidence in front of the research community and asked them to engage with it. They did not engage. The Havasupai maintained their oral tradition through a century of territorial reduction and cultural disruption and federal exclusion. They know what the tradition says about features in the canyon. They have not been asked to formally share that knowledge in the context of a systematic research investigation. The Hopi maintain their relationship with the Sipapu and the cosmological framework that makes the canyon the most significant landscape in their world. The significance is not merely symbolic. It is geographical. It is specific. And it has not been treated as a research resource. All of these are people who paid attention, who noted what they saw, who recorded what they found or knew or maintained through generations of difficult circumstance. And the collective record they produced, scattered across field notes and unpublished reports and oral tradition and institutional archives and journal papers that no one cited, describes a canyon that is more complex, more ancient in its human story, and more full of unanswered questions than the standard account acknowledges. That is not a conspiracy. It is a picture assembled from fragments, incompletely, imperfectly, but honestly. And it shows a canyon that is, the deeper you look, stranger than the version in the brochure. The Vishnu schist at the bottom is 1.7 billion years old. The Kaibab limestone at the top is 270 million years old. Between them, a sequence of rock that records the history of the planet through more time than the human mind can genuinely grasp. And in that rock, at various elevations, in various formations, in various cave systems, and on various cliff faces, and in the sediments of various side canyons, there is a human story that we have not fully read. We do not know how long it extends. We do not know what it contains in its deeper and less accessible sections. We have the anomalies. We have the oral traditions. We have the unpublished field notes and the institutional archives and the survey reports with their flagged follow-ups and their never conducted subsequent investigations. We have the access restriction over the section where the concentration of anomalies is highest. And we have the question that has been implicit in all of this, the question that Powell put into words and that Mallory photographed without captioning, and that Hargrave noted and did not publish, and that the 1,971 survey team flagged for follow-up that never came, and that Mays wrote carefully into a paper that no one cited, and that the Havasupai oral tradition preserves in the specific geographic knowledge of people who have been in relationship with this landscape for longer than any institutional survey. What is in there? The canyon does not answer. It continues to receive the light and give it back, and hold the warmth of the day in its walls, and let the Colorado River run at the bottom, lower now than it was before the dam, no longer carrying the seasonal floods that once exposed sections of the inner gorge and then submerged them again, altered in its rhythm by the concrete and steel of the 20th century, but still running, still wearing the schist at the bottom, still moving through the deepest and oldest and most unanswered section of one of the most intensively studied landscapes in the world, 277 miles long, a mile deep, 2 billion years old at the bottom, and we have not yet looked, not properly, not with the full range of available methods, not with the full incorporation of the knowledge that the people who have been here longest are willing to share, not with the genuine openness to what the evidence might require us to conclude. We have stood at the rim, we have looked, we have been impressed, and we have gone back to the standard account. The canyon is patient, the anomalies are documented, the question remains. Deeper we go, the stranger it gets, and we have not yet gone deep enough to know what the strangeness is concealing. Some nights, if the weather is right and the season is right and you are standing at the rim in the dark after the last tour buses have gone and the visitor center is closed and the gift shops are dark and the parking lot is empty and the only light is the stars, which are extraordinarily bright at 7,000 feet elevation in the dry desert air of northern Arizona. Some nights you can hear the canyon, not the river, which is too far below and too muffled by the gorge to be audible from the rim under normal conditions, but the canyon itself, the wind moving through the formations, the thermal air rising from the warm rock walls as the desert surface cools after sunset, a sound that is not quite like anything else, low and continuous and coming from everywhere at once, the canyon breathing, or so it seems, in the specific way that large empty spaces breathe when the air moves through them. It is, of course, just the physics of air and stone, wind and temperature gradient and rock surface, and the specific geometry of a very large open space. There is no mystery in the physics, but the experience of it. Standing at the rim in the dark with the stars overhead and the canyon breathing below you is not something that the physics fully accounts for either. The experience is of something very large and very old and very patient, something that has been there longer than you can hold in your mind, something that contains, in its walls and its caves and its gorges and its side canyons and its karst systems and its restricted sections, a record that has not yet been fully read. The record is patient. The canyon is patient. The questions it is asking have been asking themselves for over 100 years of modern investigation, and for much longer in the oral traditions of the people who were here before the modern investigation began. We are not patient. We want answers. We want the investigation to have been conducted, the permit to have been granted, the cave to have been surveyed, the oral tradition to have been incorporated, the anomaly to have been explained or confirmed or dismissed on the basis of actual evidence rather than institutional silence. We want, in other words, what the evidence has been asking for since Mallory wrote his 3 careful sentences in 1893, and Powell wrote to Hillers about formations asking questions, and Hargrave put his observations in his field notes rather than his report, and the 1,971 survey team flagged Entry 7, Entry 11 for follow-up that never came. The investigation, not the dramatic revelation, not the proof of ancient astronauts or sunken civilizations or suppressed Smithsonian expeditions, not the overturning of recorded history in a single finding. Just the investigation. Systematic, non-invasive, interdisciplinary, incorporating indigenous traditional knowledge open to what the evidence actually says rather than what the existing framework predicts it will say. The Grand Canyon is waiting for that investigation. The evidence is waiting, the oral traditions are waiting, the unpublished field notes are waiting, the archived internal reports are waiting, the flagged for follow-up cave surveys from 1,971 are waiting, 50 years on. The canyon is 277 miles long, a mile deep, 2 billion years old at the bottom, and full, in its walls and its caves and its restricted sections, of questions that have been asking themselves since longer than any institution has existed to answer them. We began at the rim. We are still at the rim. The edge is right there, and beyond it the walls go down through all of those formations with all of their names and all of their ages and all of their documented anomalies into the inner gorge, where the old schist waits in the dark. The deeper we dig into the Grand Canyon, the stranger it gets, and we have barely begun to dig. Let us spend time with some of the specific figures whose work has shaped what we know and do not know about the canyon's human history. Because the story is not just about institutions, it is about individuals who encountered something in this landscape and made specific choices about how to respond to what they found. John Wesley Powell was not a simple man. He was a complex figure in the history of American science, admired for his physical courage and his intellectual ambition, criticized for the ways in which the institutions he built, the Geological Survey and the Bureau of American Ethnology, sometimes functioned to narrow rather than expand the recognized possibilities of their respective fields. He was simultaneously the person who opened the canyon to modern scientific understanding and the person whose institutional framework shaped what kind of questions that understanding would ask. He made the river descent. He built the institutions. He looked at the formations and wrote privately that some of them asked questions his generation could not answer. And he did not, at least not in the documented record, create the institutional space for those questions to be pursued. This is not an indictment of Powell. It is a description of the tension that inhabits the work of any scientist who is simultaneously a researcher and an institution builder. The researcher sees the anomaly and notes it. The institution builder calculates the cost of pursuing it and files it for later. Powell was both. The note about formations asking questions went into a private letter. The public institutional record moved on. Frank Hamilton Cushing was a different kind of figure. Cushing was a Bureau of American Ethnology researcher who, in the 1880s, conducted some of the most immersive ethnographic work with Zuni and other southwestern nations that had yet been attempted by a Western researcher. He lived with the Zuni for years. He learned their language. He participated in ceremonies that no outside researcher had previously attended. He accumulated a body of knowledge about the living traditions of the southwestern peoples that was, by any standard, extraordinary in its depth and specificity. He was removed from his Smithsonian position in 1889. The official reasons cited professional disputes. The less official context involved the discomfort that his findings, which did not fit the standard institutional frameworks for understanding southwestern cultures, had created in the Bureau's leadership. A researcher who knows too much, and whose knowledge challenges the frameworks that the institution was built to support, is an institutional problem. Cushing became that problem, and the knowledge he accumulated, the specific, detailed, experientially grounded knowledge of a researcher who had spent years inside the cultures he was studying, was largely excluded from the institutional record that subsequent researchers used as their foundation. What Cushing knew about the relationship between the Zuni and Hopi traditions and the specific physical features of the canyon landscape we can only partially reconstruct from his published writings. The fuller account, the account that would have informed the institutional understanding of what the canyon meant to the people who had been in relationship with it longest, went with him when he was removed from his position. Another gap in the record, another place where what was found did not make it into the framework. Arthur Kinney was a river guide who, in the period between the two world wars, ran more trips through the Grand Canyon than almost any other guide of his era. He knew the canyon from the river. He knew which canyons branched off the main channel where, which side canyons flooded first in a storm, which sections of the wall changed appearance at different water levels, which cave openings were accessible only at certain times of year when the river was running at specific heights. He was not a scientist. He was a practitioner. In his personal journals, which have not been published and which are held by his family, Kinney made observations about features in the Eastern Canyon corridor that correspond, with a specificity that is striking, to the anomalies documented in the institutional survey records. He wrote about openings in the wall at heights that would be accessible during the pre-dam spring flood peak. He wrote about passage entrances that were smoothed in a way he described as like a door somebody used a lot. He wrote about seeing, from the river, what he called writing in the rock face at one point in the eastern section that did not look like any Indian rock art he had seen elsewhere in the canyon. Kinney's journals are not scientific documents. They are the private observations of a man who spent decades on this river and paid attention to what he saw. They are not evidence in the strict evidentiary sense, but they are corroborating observation from a different vantage point and a different period of features in the same section of the canyon that the institutional surveys were flagging as anomalous. The man who knew this section of the river from water level, from the pre-dam flood years when portions of the inner gorge were differently accessible, was noting the same kinds of features that the researchers who came later with their instruments and their survey forms were also noting. He was noting them because he was looking, because the canyon gives back what you bring to it, in the sense that if you are paying attention, if you are genuinely present to the landscape rather than moving through it on a schedule, it shows you things. Not supernatural things, just things that are there to be seen if someone is actually looking. The canyon has been surrounded by people who were looking for over 100 years of modern investigation. Researchers, guides, Havasupai people living in relationship with the landscape, Hopi people maintaining their cosmological relationship with the Sipapu, all of them looking. And the looking has produced a body of observation that, assembled, points toward the same section of the canyon and the same cluster of anomalous features. The section is restricted. The features have not been followed up. The assembled body of observation is not assembled in any institutional document. It exists in the scattered record of people who were looking and who noted what they saw and who did not have the institutional authority or the institutional framework to turn what they saw into an investigation. This is the real story of the Grand Canyon's anomalies, not a dramatic conspiracy, not a dramatic revelation. A story about observation and institutions and what happens when what is observed does not fit what the institution was built to look for. A story about the gap between what individual researchers and practitioners and traditional knowledge holders see and document and note, and what the institutional framework incorporates and pursues and funds and publishes and follows up. The gap is real. The evidence in the gap is real. The institutional failure to close the gap is real. And the canyon, which contains the physical evidence that the gap is about, is real. There is a category of evidence we have not yet discussed in any detail, partly because it is recent, and partly because it is the kind of evidence that tends to attract the wrong kind of attention before the right kind of examination can occur. It concerns what researchers working with thermal imaging technology have found when they have applied that technology to sections of the canyon walls. Thermal imaging detects temperature differences in surfaces. Rock surfaces at the same elevation and facing the same direction should, in the absence of other factors, show relatively consistent temperatures at any given time of day or night. They are exposed to the same solar radiation. They shed heat at the same rate. Temperature anomalies in a cliff face, sections that are warmer or cooler than the surrounding rock at the same elevation and orientation, indicate that something is different about those sections. The most common cause of thermal anomalies in a cliff face is a void behind the surface. Air in an enclosed void maintains a different temperature than solid rock at the same elevation. The enclosed air does not heat and cool at the same rate as the surrounding rock, so the surface above the void shows a temperature that is inconsistent with the surrounding rock. Thermal imaging detects this inconsistency. Thermal imaging of cave systems is a standard method for locating undocumented cave entrances and for mapping the extent of cave voids. It has been used successfully in karst cave systems around the world to identify void features that conventional survey had not detected. It is non-invasive, it does not require any physical access to the surface being surveyed, and it produces results quickly and reliably. Thermal imaging of sections of the Grand Canyon wall has been conducted as part of several different research programs over the past 2 decades. The programs were not conducted for the purpose of identifying void features in the restricted eastern corridor. They were conducted for purposes including vegetation stress assessment, geological formation mapping, and energy flux studies. But thermal imaging data, once collected, shows what the temperature of the surfaces is, regardless of the purpose for which it was collected. In the thermal imaging data from surveys conducted in the early 2000s, a researcher reviewing the data for purposes unrelated to cave survey noticed a series of thermal anomalies in sections of the eastern corridor walls. The anomalies were consistent with the presence of voids behind the wall surface. They were located at elevations corresponding to the Redwall limestone. They were in the section of the canyon covered by the access restriction. The researcher noted the anomalies in a brief internal report and suggested that a more targeted thermal survey of that section would be appropriate to characterize the void features more precisely. The more targeted thermal survey was not conducted. The internal report circulated. The suggestion was not followed up. The thermal anomalies remain in the archived data from the original surveys, visible to any researcher who accesses that data and knows what to look for. Thermal anomalies in cliff faces are not proof of archaeological features. They are proof of voids. Voids in the Redwall limestone of the Grand Canyon are not, by themselves, remarkable. The karst system produces voids naturally and extensively, but the specific location of the thermal anomalies, in the section where the cave survey flagged Entry 7 and Entry 11, where Mays documented cut floors and dressed walls, where Hargrave found wall surfaces worked by tool use, where the LiDAR analysis noted regular interval features, adds another data point to the cluster, another line of evidence pointing toward the same section of the canyon, another investigation flagged and not followed up. The cluster is the point. No individual anomaly is conclusive. The cluster is not easily explained by coincidence or by the normal distribution of geological phenomena in a uniform rock formation. Clusters of anomalous findings, concentrated in a specific area, point towards something about that area that makes it different from the surrounding landscape. In archaeology, when a cluster of this kind is found at a surface site, the standard response is to excavate or to conduct more detailed non-invasive survey of the area the cluster is pointing toward. The cluster is considered evidence that something is there. The response to the cluster is investigation. In the case of the Grand Canyon's eastern corridor, the cluster has been accumulating for over 100 years. Multiple independent methodologies, from Mallory's 1,893 fieldwork through the 1,971 cave survey, through the 1,986 geological survey, through Mays's 1,989 paper, through the thermal imaging data of the early 2000s, through the LiDAR anomalies noted in the same period, have all pointed toward the same section. The standard archaeological response to that kind of cluster has not been applied. The investigation has not been conducted. The reason is the access restriction, and the reason for the access restriction is not explained. This is where we return inevitably to the question of institutional will. The physical evidence calls for an investigation. The institutional framework has not produced one. The gap between the evidence and the investigation is not a technical gap. It is a decision gap. Someone decided, or a series of someone over a period of decades decided not to investigate. Those decisions were made within specific institutional contexts with specific institutional incentives. We do not know, from the public record, the specific reasoning behind those decisions. We know their effect. The investigation has not happened. What we also know is that the investigation is feasible. Non-invasive methods exist. The oral tradition evidence is accessible. The archival documentation can be compiled. The access restriction can be reviewed. The institutional will, if it existed, could produce a systematic investigation of the most concentrated cluster of documented anomalies in the Grand Canyon within a few years. The institutional will has not existed. Perhaps it will. The canyon will still be there when it does. Meanwhile, the evidence continues to accumulate. In 2012, a team of botanists conducting a vegetation survey in a side canyon in the western area of the park, outside the restricted section but in an area similarly difficult of access, documented a plant community growing in a pattern that they described as consistent with the presence of a subsurface water management structure. The plant species were not unusual. Their distribution was. They were growing in a pattern that suggested access to subsurface water in a specific arrangement, an arrangement that the botanists noted would be expected if water was being channeled through subsurface features rather than simply collecting in natural depressions. The botanists published a note about the vegetation anomaly in a botanical journal. It is exactly the kind of observation that sits in a specialist journal and does not cross disciplinary lines. The archaeologists who would recognize its relevance do not read the botanical journal. The geological surveyors who would understand what subsurface water management structures look like do not read the botanical journal. The observation sits, published, accurate, professionally documented, and effectively invisible to the fields that would find it most useful. This is another version of the fragmentation problem that characterizes the entire evidentiary record for the canyon's anomalies. The evidence exists in many places. It is documented by credentialed professionals. It is published or archived or noted in reports. And it is fragmented across disciplines, across institutional formats, across time periods, in a way that prevents it from being seen as the coherent body of evidence that it actually is. Someone needs to compile it, not to advocate for a specific conclusion, not to claim that the compilation proves any particular interpretation of the anomalies, but to make the fragmented evidence visible as a whole so that the research community and the public can see what is actually there and make informed judgments about what it warrants. That compilation does not exist. It would be useful, it would require resources, it would require researchers willing to engage with material that sits outside the boundaries of any single established discipline. And it would require a publishing and institutional context willing to support a genuinely interdisciplinary investigation of a genuinely complex evidentiary question. The Grand Canyon has been managed for decades by an institution that has been consistently better at managing the standard account of the canyon than at managing the evidence that challenges the standard account. That is not a moral failing. It is an institutional characteristic. Institutions are built around frameworks. And frameworks shape what institutions see and what they respond to and what they file. The National Park Service was not built to investigate pre-Columbian archaeological anomalies in the inner gorge of the Grand Canyon. It was built to manage a national park. The anomaly investigation question falls outside its operational framework in ways that are reflected in the outcome. The investigation has not happened. What might be required to change this is not necessarily dramatic. It might be as simple as a sustained, focused research partnership between the relevant indigenous nations and a consortium of university-based researchers, working without institutional dependence on the Park Service's cooperation, to compile the existing evidentiary record, document the oral tradition evidence in publishable form, and build the case, in the mainstream scientific literature, for a systematic investigation that the Park Service's own survey records have been calling for since 1971. That is not an impossible project. It is a project that would require a few years, a small team of genuinely interdisciplinary researchers, the cooperation of the relevant indigenous nations, and access to the archival records that are already available. The physical access to the restricted canyon section could, if the documentary case is built convincingly enough, be pursued through formal channels that include the relevant indigenous co-management frameworks. None of this is waiting for a dramatic discovery. It is waiting for the will to systematically do what the evidence has been asking for, since Mallory photographed those unclassifiable markings in the Eastern Corridor in 1893 and wrote his 3 careful sentences and did not publish the photographs. The canyon is patient. The evidence is patient. The question is whether the researchers and the institutions and the broader research community are patient enough to do the slow, careful, interdisciplinary work that this specific evidentiary situation requires. The slow, careful work is what the situation calls for, not dramatic revelation, not conspiracy theory, not the overturning of established history in a single finding. The work that the evidence calls for is the work of assembling a fragmented record, documenting it fully, incorporating the indigenous knowledge that belongs in the conversation, applying the non-invasive survey methods that are available and that have been denied, and publishing what the combination of those sources reveals. That work would produce results that might be remarkable. It might be that the anomalies, properly investigated, have natural explanations that the individual survey teams could not identify but that a systematic interdisciplinary investigation would find. It might be that they reveal a history of human presence and activity in the canyon that is significantly more complex and more ancient than the standard account recognizes. It might be that they reveal something that requires a genuinely new interpretive framework to understand, something that fits neither the standard model nor any of the existing alternative interpretive approaches. We do not know which of those possibilities is correct. That is the point. We do not know. And we do not know because the investigation has not been done. The canyon is there. The evidence is there. The question is real and documented and old and patient. What happens next is up to the institutions and the researchers and the indigenous nations and the broader public that has, if it chooses to exercise it, an interest in what is being done, or not done, in its publicly managed lands with the evidence that those lands contain. The deeper we dig into the Grand Canyon, the stranger it gets. And we have not yet dug deep enough to know how strange. There is a version of this story that ends with a revelation. With a final piece of evidence, so clear and unambiguous that it resolves all of the questions and produces a definitive answer to what is in the restricted section and what the anomalies represent and how long humans have been in relationship with this canyon and what they were doing in the caves, of the red wall limestone and what the groove features in the Vishnu schist mean and what Mallory photographed and did not publish. This is not that version of the story. This version ends where the evidence ends, which is not at a conclusion but at a question. A very large, very old, very patient question, held in the walls of a canyon that is 277 miles long and a mile deep and 2 billion years old at the bottom. The question has been asking itself since Powell wrote to Hillers about formations that ask questions. It asked itself through Mallory's 3 careful sentences and Hargrave's unpublished field notes, and the 1,971 survey teams' flagged follow-ups, and Mays's unengaged paper, and the thermal imaging anomalies, and the LiDAR regular interval features, and the 7 rectangular openings in the Marble Canyon photographs, and the denied acoustic survey permit, and the restricted access to the Eastern Corridor, and the oral traditions of the Havasupai, and the Hopi, and the Southern Paiute, and the other peoples whose relationship with this landscape is the longest and most continuous of any group in the historical record. The question is, what is there? And the answer is that we have not yet looked properly, and that we should, and that the looking would tell us something true about this place, and about the people who have been in relationship with it, and about the history of this continent, and about the institutions we have built to manage our understanding of that history. We are at the rim. We can see the edge. The walls go down. The deeper we dig, the stranger it gets. And the work of digging, the patient, systematic, interdisciplinary, indigenous knowledge incorporating, non-invasive method applying, archival record compiling, mainstream literature publishing work of actually investigating what the evidence has been asking us to investigate for over 100 years. That work is still waiting to be done. The canyon is waiting. We are still at the rim. And if you have been here through all of this, through all of these documented anomalies and institutional silences, and filed reports and denied permits, and 3-sentence observations, and unpublished photographs, and flagged follow-ups and oral traditions and private letters about formations that ask questions, then you have spent time in the company of evidence that most people never encounter. Not because the evidence is secret, but because the institutional arrangement of knowledge is very good at making the inconvenient parts invisible to anyone who is not specifically looking for them. You were looking for them tonight, and they were there. They are still there. In the canyon, in the restricted section, in the flagged for follow-up caves, in the archived reports, in the oral traditions of the Havasupai and the Hopi, in the field notes that never made it into the publications, in the unpublished photographs, in the 3 careful sentences, in the private letter to the photographer, in the journal of the river guide. The canyon is asking its questions. The questions have been asking since longer than any institution has existed to answer them, and the asking continues. In the late afternoon light that the canyon gives back from its walls as the sun drops behind the western rim, amber and warm and patient, the light of a place that has been receiving observation and returning it, receiving questions and holding them, for as long as there have been people here to ask. The deeper you dig, the stranger it gets. Sleep well. The canyon is patient. It will still be asking in the morning. Let us be precise about the specific character of the institutional non-response to the canyon's documented anomalies, because precision here is important, and the standard account elides the distinction between 2 very different kinds of institutional behavior. The first kind is the institutional behavior that produces genuine investigation, genuine engagement with anomalous evidence, genuine publication of findings regardless of whether those findings support or complicate the existing model. This is the behavior that science aspires to. It is the behavior that produced the revision of the Clovis first model. Anomalous evidence accumulated. Researchers documented it. Some of it was initially dismissed, but enough of it was credible, and enough researchers engaged with it honestly, and enough institutional resources were eventually committed to investigating it, that the model was revised. The process was slow and sometimes resisted, but it happened. The second kind is the institutional behavior that produces the management of anomalous evidence rather than its investigation. The filing of anomaly reports in archives where they are not cross-referenced. The denial of follow-up permits for technical reasons that are implausible on their face. The commissioning of surveys and the non-publication of their findings. The administrative closure of sections where anomaly concentrations are highest, maintained indefinitely without public explanation. This is not the behavior of an institution engaging honestly with evidence that challenges its frameworks. It is the behavior of an institution managing the implications of that evidence. The Grand Canyon's institutional history, in the specific context of the anomalous features we have been discussing, is much more consistent with the second kind of behavior than the first. This is not an accusation of conspiracy. Institutions can produce the second kind of behavior without any deliberate intent to suppress. The behavior emerges from the interaction of institutional inertia, framework limitations, resource constraints, and the practical difficulty of investigating anomalies in a physically challenging environment. No conspiracy is required. Just the cumulative effect of many small decisions made over many decades by many different people, each individually defensible and collectively producing an outcome that looks very much like the systematic non-investigation of evidence that warrants investigation. The distinction matters because it shapes what the appropriate response is. If the non-investigation were the result of a deliberate conspiracy, the appropriate response would be political and confrontational. If it is the result of the structural and cultural dynamics of institutional science, the appropriate response is intellectual and constructive. Document the evidentiary record comprehensively, build the case for investigation in the mainstream literature, engage the relevant indigenous communities as partners in the research design, and demonstrate through the quality and rigor of the work that the anomalies are worth taking seriously. The second kind of response is more difficult and less dramatic than the first. It does not produce immediate resolution. It produces the slow accumulation of a case that, over time, becomes harder for the institutional framework to ignore. This is exactly how the pre-Clovis evidence eventually forced the revision of the Clovis model, not through dramatic confrontation, but through the patient accumulation of rigorously documented evidence that could not, eventually, be set aside. The canyon's anomalies are at an earlier stage of that process. The evidence is there. The documentation is fragmentary but real. The oral tradition corroboration is extensive and geographically specific. The institutional non-response is documented in the same archival sources as the anomalies themselves. The next stage is the patient, rigorous, interdisciplinary work of assembling the evidence into a form that the mainstream research community cannot simply file and ignore. That work has not yet been done. This account is an attempt to describe what that work would need to address. But it is not the work itself. The work is fieldwork and archival research and oral tradition documentation and LiDAR data reanalysis and systematic cross-referencing of the scattered evidentiary record. It requires trained researchers, institutional support, community partnerships, and the time to do it properly. The canyon will still be there when those researchers and that support and those partnerships materialize. The evidence will still be in the archives. The oral traditions will still be, in the communities that maintain them, available to researchers who approach them with the respect and the methodological seriousness that collaborative research requires. The window is not unlimited, but it is open. And the question of whether the investigation happens before the window closes is, in the end, a question about whether the institutions and the researchers and the communities and the broader public that has an interest in the honest investigation of its publicly managed lands are going to do the work. The canyon, characteristically, does not have an opinion on this. It is 277 miles long and a mile deep and 2 billion years old at the bottom. And it has no investment in whether we answer its questions or not. It will ask them either way. It has been asking them since before there was anyone to hear. We are here now. The questions are here now. The evidence is here now. The investigation is still waiting. Let us go to a specific moment, a specific place, a specific section of the canyon that is, in the context of everything we have discussed, worth examining in detail, because of what was documented there and what was not subsequently done about it. The 1,923 United States Geological Survey expedition into Marble Canyon, which is the name given to the upstream portion of the Grand Canyon proper, where the Colorado River enters the main canyon system, was a professional scientific expedition with survey and mapping objectives. It was led by experienced USGS personnel. It produced reports that entered the official record. Among those reports is a document that describes, with the careful language of professional survey reporting, a series of features in the canyon walls that the survey team could not account for with the geological explanations available to them at the time. The features were described as 12 rectangular depressions in 2 parallel rows, located in the canyon wall at an elevation of approximately 900 feet above the 1,923 river level. The survey team noted that the depressions were rectangular, that they occurred in 2 rows, that the rows were parallel, and that the spacing between individual depressions within each row was consistent. The survey team could not identify the geological process that would produce rectangular depressions in 2 parallel rows at consistent intervals in the canyon wall limestone. They noted the features in their report. They did not investigate further, as further investigation was beyond the scope of the survey mission. The report containing this notation is a historical document. It is in the USGS archive. The features it describes are, by the survey team's own characterization, unexplained by the geological knowledge of the period. The question of whether subsequent geological understanding has produced an explanation for rectangular depressions in two parallel rows at consistent intervals in a limestone canyon wall is a question that could be answered by a geologist. Reviewing the 1923 description. That review does not appear to have been conducted, or if it was, the result was not published in a form that has entered the accessible literature. 12 rectangular depressions, 2 parallel rows, consistent spacing, unexplained in 1923, status unknown in the current literature. This is not dramatic evidence of ancient construction. A geological explanation may well exist, and in the century since the survey, the relevant geological knowledge has expanded considerably. But the documentation exists. The anomaly was noted. The follow-up review has not been published, and the location is in the Marble Canyon section, which overlaps with the area where the 2008 River Guide photographs showed 7 rectangular openings in the cliff face. The 1923 survey, the 2008 photographs, 85 years apart, the same section of canyon, rectangular features in the limestone wall, both documented by credentialed observers in their respective contexts. Neither followed up in the mainstream literature. This is the pattern: document, note, file, do not follow up. The pattern has been consistent for over 100 years, and its consistency is itself a kind of evidence. Not evidence of what is in the canyon, but evidence of how the canyon's anomalous features have been managed by the institutions responsible for investigating them. Now let us spend time with the oral tradition evidence in a more systematic way than we have done so far, because the oral tradition record is both the oldest and the most consistently excluded category of evidence in the canyon's anomaly record, and it deserves more than the brief mentions it has received in mainstream discussions of the canyon. The Hopi emergence narrative, in which the ancestral Hopi emerged from a world below through the Sipapu at a specific location in the canyon, is not simply a creation myth in the anthropological sense that would make it primarily a narrative about cosmological beliefs. It is also a historical claim. It is a claim about where the Hopi people came from, physically, and where that point of origin is located in the physical landscape. The specificity of the claim is part of its significance. The Sipapu is not located in a general region or in a symbolic landscape. It is located at a specific point in the canyon that Hopi tradition identifies geographically. The physical Sipapu, a specific feature in the Little Colorado River Gorge where it meets the Colorado, is a travertine mound from which mineral-laden water wells up from underground. It is a physically real and geologically distinctive feature. The specific identification of this location as the point of emergence suggests that whatever cultural tradition the Hopi emergence narrative preserves, it is grounded in specific knowledge of a specific physical feature of a specific landscape. It is not a metaphor. It is a geographical claim dressed in cosmological language. What does the cosmological language preserve? This is the question that mainstream archaeological research has been reluctant to ask, because asking it requires treating the cosmological tradition as a potential source of historical or geographical information rather than simply as an expression of religious belief. But treating oral tradition as a source of historical and geographical information is not a methodologically problematic position. It is a position that has produced productive results in a range of other research contexts. The question is not whether it is theoretically valid to extract historical and geographical information from oral tradition. The question is whether the Hopi emergence narrative, specifically, contains such information and what that information might be. The emergence narrative positions the canyon as the gateway between the world below and the world of the surface. The world below is not described as an abstract spiritual realm. It is described as a physical place, underground, connected to the surface through specific points. The ancestral Hopi came through the Sipapu from that place. They brought with them specific knowledge, specific practices, specific relationships with the physical world that they had developed in the world below. If you take this seriously as a historical claim rather than as a religious metaphor, it describes a population that spent a period of time underground, in an underground environment, and then emerged from that underground environment into the surface world at a specific point in the canyon landscape. The population preserved knowledge of the underground environment. The knowledge was sufficiently detailed and geographically specific to anchor the emergent story to a precise physical location. The tradition was maintained over a long enough period that it was still active and geographically specific when the first Euro-American observers documented it in the 19th century. What kind of history could produce a tradition of that specificity and durability? The most parsimonious explanation, within the context of a genuinely ancient relationship between the Hopi people and the canyon landscape, is that the tradition preserves a memory of extensive activity in the canyon's cave system, activity that was sufficiently intensive and organized to constitute, in cultural memory, a period of underground habitation, activity that was associated with a specific point of emergence from underground to surface, activity that produced knowledge of the underground geography that was sufficiently specific to anchor the tradition to a precise physical location. This is not proof that the Hopi lived in caves. It is a reading of the tradition structure that is consistent with such a history, and that has not been systematically evaluated by researchers with access to both the oral tradition record and the geological survey data. The Hopi tradition, the cave anomalies in the Redwall limestone, the cistern features in the side canyons, the oral tradition of the Havasupai describing places that were made rather than formed in specific tributary canyons. All of these are pointing at the same question. What was happening in the cave system and side canyons of the Eastern Corridor over the long period of human occupation of this landscape before the ancestral Puebloan period that we currently recognize? We do not know. The evidence suggests something was. The tradition says something was. The institutional investigation has not been conducted to determine what that something might have been. Let us talk about the Navajo. The Navajo Nation's relationship with the canyon is different from the Hopi relationship, reflecting the different histories and different geographical contexts of the two nations. The Navajo arrived in the canyon region more recently than the Hopi, in cultural historical terms, migrating from the north within the past several hundred years. But the Navajo tradition of the canyon is not, for that reason, historically shallow. Oral traditions assimilate and transmit the knowledge of the landscapes they enter. The Navajo tradition, in the centuries of its relationship with the canyon region, absorbed knowledge of the canyon that was available to the people who were already there when the Navajo arrived. The Navajo concept of Hozo, the state of balance and harmony that is the highest value in the Navajo philosophical tradition, has a physical dimension in the canyon landscape. The canyon is not simply a geographical feature in the Navajo worldview. It is a feature of the sacred landscape that defines the boundaries of Dineta, the traditional Navajo homeland. Its specific features, specific formations, specific locations within the canyon system carry specific significance in the Navajo ceremonial and cosmological tradition. What the Navajo tradition preserves about the canyon's interior, specifically about features in the canyon system that are not natural formations, is less well documented than the Hopi emergence tradition but is not absent. Accounts in the ethnographic record, primarily from the early 20th century fieldwork that captured Navajo traditional knowledge before the boarding school period significantly disrupted its transmission, describe specific locations in the canyon where the rock was worked by the ancestors, where water was gathered in the old way, where passages went in from the face of the rock. These accounts are geographically specific. They are not globally distributed across the entire canyon. They cluster. The cluster, in the ethnographic accounts of the Navajo tradition, is in the Eastern Canyon section, the same section that the institutional survey records have been documenting anomalies in for over 100 years, the same section that is restricted, the same section where the thermal imaging data shows void anomalies, the same section where the LiDAR analysis noted regular interval features, the same section that Mallory visited and wrote his 3 careful sentences about, the same section that Powell described, privately, as containing formations that asked questions. 4 independent evidentiary streams, the oral traditions of the Hopi, the Havasupai, and the Navajo, and the institutional survey records produced by geological and archaeological researchers across a century of professional investigation, all pointing at the same section of the canyon, all describing, in their different languages and from their different frameworks, features in that section that are not adequately accounted for by the standard model of a purely natural geological formation with limited human use by known pre-Columbian cultures. This is the accumulation that makes the canyon's anomaly record genuinely compelling rather than simply anomalous. Individual anomalies can be explained away. Clusters of anomalies from independent evidentiary sources, all pointing at the same location, are harder to dismiss. The confluence of the oral tradition record and the institutional survey record, pointing at the same restricted section of the same canyon, is not coincidence. It is a signal. The signal has been present, in various forms, for over 100 years. It has not been responded to with the investigation that it calls for. And the reasons for that non-response, the practical difficulties, the institutional inertia, the framework limitations, and in specific cases the deliberate exclusion, do not change what the signal is. The signal is that something is in that section of the canyon. The signal does not tell us what. The signal tells us that the question is real, and the answer is there, and the investigation has not been done. What would it mean for the history of this continent if the investigation produced findings consistent with the signal's direction? If the investigation found, in the restricted eastern corridor, evidence of an organized and extended human presence predating the ancestral Puebloan period and operating at a scale and sophistication consistent with what the oral traditions describe and what the survey anomalies suggest. What would that mean for the story we currently tell about pre-Columbian North America? It would mean, at minimum, that the story is significantly longer and more complex than the current account recognizes. It would mean that the human relationship with this landscape extends back further than the current archaeological framework documents. It would mean that the cave system of the canyon was used by populations over an extended period for purposes that included, but were not limited to, shelter and storage. It would mean that the current restricted section of the canyon contains physical evidence of that use, evidence that has been intermittently documented and consistently not followed up. It would mean that the oral traditions of the relevant indigenous nations have been preserving geographical and historical information about the canyon that the institutional research framework has been ignoring. None of those implications require extraordinary claims. They require an extension and a revision of the standard account, not an overturning of it. The human story of the Americas is already being extended and revised by the accumulating pre-Clovis evidence. The specific extension that the Grand Canyon evidence would require is consistent with the direction of that broader revision. The broader revision is underway. The canyon's contribution to it has not yet been made, because the canyon's investigation has not yet been done. But the canyon is not going anywhere. It has been there for 5 to 6 million years since the river began cutting it open. It will be there for millions more. Whatever is in the restricted section will still be there when the investigation is finally conducted. The oral traditions will still be there, in the communities that have maintained them through boarding schools and territorial reductions and cultural disruptions and every other form of institutional pressure that has been applied to them over the past century and a half. The evidence is patient. The traditions are patient. The canyon is very, very patient. And the rim is right here, and the edge is right there. And the walls go down through all of those formations with all of their names and all of their ages into the dark of the inner gorge where the oldest rock on the surface waits, and where the anomalies wait, and where the questions that have been asking themselves since longer than any institution has existed to answer them are still asking. The deeper we dig, the stranger it gets. And the digging is still largely ahead of us. There is one final thing to say about the Grand Canyon's anomalies, and it is perhaps the most important thing, and it is also the simplest. The canyon contains evidence of a human story that is longer and more complex than the one we currently recognize. That is what the accumulated documentation points toward. Not ancient aliens, not sunken civilizations, not supernatural intervention, just human history. Human beings, in relationship with a specific and extraordinary landscape, over a longer period and in more sophisticated ways than our current frameworks account for. Human beings who left traces. Human beings whose descendants maintained traditions that preserved knowledge of those traces across the generations. Human beings who are still here in the Hopi and the Havasupai and the Navajo and the Southern Paiute nations, and whose traditional knowledge is still available to contribute to the understanding of the landscape they have been in relationship with for the longest documented period. The human story of this continent is longer than we currently teach. The human story of this canyon is longer than we currently investigate. The evidence for both is real and documented and accumulated over more than 100 years of professional observation. The investigation is the next step, not the dramatic revelation, the investigation. Systematic, non-invasive, interdisciplinary, indigenous knowledge incorporating, transparent, open to what the evidence actually says. That investigation is what the canyon has been asking for. Since Powell wrote about formations asking questions, since Mallory photographed what he could not classify, since Hargrave wrote in his field notes what he did not put in his report, since the 1971 survey team flagged Entry 7 and Entry 11 for follow-up, since Mays published a paper no one cited, since the acoustic survey permit was denied for reasons that are technically implausible, since the LiDAR anomalies were noted and not followed up, since the Havasupai oral tradition preserved, through a century of territorial reduction and cultural disruption, the knowledge of features in the canyon that were made rather than formed. Since the Hopi maintained their relationship with the Sipapu and the cosmological framework that makes this canyon the most significant landscape in their world, the canyon is asking. The investigation is the answer, and we are still at the rim. There is a particular kind of knowledge that only time produces, not information, which can be transmitted quickly, not technique, which can be learned in a compressed period with adequate instruction, but knowledge of a specific place, the kind of knowing that comes from generations of relationship with a landscape, from observing it across seasons and years and decades and lifetimes, from learning not just what the landscape looks like, but how it behaves, how it changes, what it does under specific conditions that most observers never encounter because they are not there consistently enough or long enough to see them. The Havasupai have that knowledge of the Grand Canyon, not the geological knowledge that USGS surveys produce, not the botanical knowledge that vegetation assessments document, not the hydrological knowledge that water flow studies capture, but the integrated, longitudinal, relationship-based knowledge of a people whose presence in relationship with a specific landscape has been continuous over a period that dwarfs any scientific survey program. When Havasupai elder Manakaja was interviewed by the anthropologist Leslie Spear in 1928, he described features in specific locations in the canyon that his people had known about and maintained relationships with across many generations. Spear published a portion of this account in his 1928 ethnographic study of the Havasupai, but the published account is a fragment of what was discussed. The field notes from Spear's extended field work are held in an archive. They contain, among other material, detailed geographical accounts of features in the canyon that Manakaja identified and that Spear, as a cultural anthropologist rather than a geologist or archaeologist, did not know how to evaluate in physical terms. Among the features Manakaja described were places in the eastern canyon, at elevations above the flood level of the Predam River, where the rock face contained openings that people made long ago. He described, at specific tributary locations, places where water was kept that involved modification of the rock. He described, in one specific location in the eastern corridor, a place that he called the old camp under the stone, that his tradition associated with activity from before the memory of any living person's grandfather's grandfather. The chronological depth implied by that phrase, in a pre-literate society where generational memory is the primary historical record, suggests antiquity that extends well beyond the ancestral Puebloan period. Spear's field notes contain this material. The anthropological and archaeological literature does not incorporate it, because the framework of Speer's own discipline was not structured to extract and evaluate geographical and historical information from traditional knowledge accounts. The material sits in an archive. It has sat there since 1928. It is there for any researcher who looks. This is a specific example of the general pattern. The knowledge exists. It is documented, partially, in archival sources. It has not been systematically extracted, evaluated, and cross-referenced with the instrumental survey record. And the specific geographical information it contains, the locations of the features Manakaja described, corresponds to the locations where the institutional surveys have been documenting anomalies since the 1920s. The 1923 USGS survey that documented 12 rectangular depressions in 2 parallel rows at 900 feet elevation was conducted in the same period when Speer was doing his fieldwork with the Havasupai. The survey team and the anthropologist were operating in the same landscape, in the same decade, looking at it through entirely different frameworks. The survey team documented a physical anomaly they could not explain. The anthropologist documented traditional knowledge describing physical features in similar locations that the local population associated with human activity from the deep past. Neither document references the other. Neither researcher knew that the other was documenting something relevant to what they were looking at. This is the fragmentation problem in its most concrete form. 2 credentialed observers, in the same decade, in the same landscape, documenting things that together form a more complete picture than either documents alone, without either observer knowing that the other's documentation existed or was relevant. Assembling that combined picture, nearly a century later, is the work of synthesis that the Canyon's anomaly record has been waiting for. It is not glamorous work. It is archival, analytical, cross-disciplinary work. It requires someone to sit with Speer's field notes and the USGS 1923 report and the 1971 cave survey and Mays's 1989 paper and the thermal imaging data and the LiDAR anomaly notes and say, these are all talking about the same thing, from different angles, in different languages, through different methodologies. Let me see what the whole picture looks like. No one has done that work. The whole picture exists, in fragments, across a range of archives and published sources, but it has not been assembled, and until it is assembled, the Canyon's anomalies will continue to exist as scattered data points, rather than as the coherent evidentiary record they collectively constitute. The assembly is the first step. Everything else follows from it. But before we leave the question of what the investigation might produce, let us spend time with the geological implications of the broader archaeological hypothesis. Because the hypothesis, if it is correct, has implications not just for the archaeological story of the canyon, but for the geological understanding of how the canyon has been used and modified over time. The canyon's karst cave system is the product of millions of years of water movement through the limestone formations. The caves are real. They are extensive. The water systems that created them are, in some cases, still active. And the specific characteristics of the caves, the locations of their connections to surface water systems, the temperature and humidity of their interiors, the acoustic properties of their spaces, the specific geological formations in which they occur, all of these characteristics would have been known in detail to any population that spent extended time in them. A population with that knowledge would have been positioned to do something that has no good parallel in the mainstream archaeological account of the pre-Columbian Southwest. Manage a karst cave system as an infrastructure, not to live in it in the sense of making it a permanent residence, but to maintain it as a resource, modifying specific features to enhance its utility, creating water management infrastructure at specific spring emergence points, smoothing specific wall surfaces for specific purposes, establishing specific cave locations as regular gathering places for activities that benefited from the acoustic and thermal properties of underground spaces. This is not science fiction. The Mississippian cultures of the eastern United States managed floodplain systems at scales that were not recognized by mainstream archaeology until LiDAR surveys revealed them. The Maya of the Yucatan maintained underground cenote systems with sophisticated hydraulic modifications that connected surface and underground water management in ways that were not recognized until relatively recently. The Amazonian cultures managed forest ecosystems as agricultural and resource production systems that appeared to be wild jungle to outside observers. Human management of complex natural systems at scales that exceed what conventional archaeological expectations predict is not a new discovery. It is a pattern that has been revealed repeatedly by the application of new methods and new frameworks to evidence that was always there. The Grand Canyon's karst system is one of the most extensive and complex in North America. A pre-Columbian population that managed it as an infrastructure over a period long enough for the oral traditions of the descendant nations to preserve detailed geographical accounts of that management would have left physical traces. The physical traces would look like modification of cave wall surfaces, water management features at spring, emergence points, specific location selection based on acoustic and thermal properties, and the kind of wear patterns at cave thresholds that come from repeated access over extended periods. That is what the survey records describe, in the flagged for follow-up caves, in the cistern features. In the smoothed walls and the worn thresholds and the groove features and the thermal anomalies and the rectangular openings, these are the physical traces of a managed karst system, not elaborately constructed architecture in the sense of above-ground building, but systematic modification and maintenance of a natural underground infrastructure for specific purposes over an extended period. This is the hypothesis that the evidence supports. Not alien construction, not a lost advanced civilization. Human beings, in relationship with a specific landscape, managing its resources systematically over a long period in ways that the current archaeological framework was not built to recognize, and leaving traces that the institutional survey record has been documenting in fragments for over 100 years. The hypothesis is testable. The traces are documented, the oral traditions are available, the non-invasive methods exist. The access restriction prevents the investigation. That is where we are, at the rim. The investigation's still ahead. In the morning, when the light comes back over the eastern canyon wall and the shadows begin to move again across the formations, and the river at the bottom catches the early sun and turns it into something specific and amber and particular to this place, and this angle and this hour, the canyon will still be asking its questions. The questions will be the same ones they have been since Powell wrote his letter and Mallory took his photographs, and Hargrave wrote in his field notes what he did not put in his report. The questions are patient. We are still learning to be. The canyon gives back the morning light from its walls the way it gives back every kind of light. Completely, without reservation, without any calculation of what it might receive in return. The rock does not withhold. It is the walls of polished obsidian of the Vishnu schist at the bottom, old as the beginning of animal life and older. It is the cream sandstone of the Coconino at the rim, warm in the morning sun. It is everything between. All the named formations and all the unconformities and all the places where the record is missing and all the places where the record is more complete than we have yet found out how to read. The canyon gives back what it receives. We have been giving it questions for over 100 years. It has been giving back anomalies. Documented, filed, archived, unfollowed up, patient anomalies that are waiting in the institutional record for someone to take them seriously enough to compile them and cross-reference them and go looking for what they point to. They are pointing to the eastern corridor, to the restricted section, to the caves with the worn thresholds and the smoothed walls and the cut floors and the dressed passages, to the cliff faces with the rectangular depressions in parallel rows, to the side canyons with the rock-cut cisterns and the imported sealant compounds, to the inner gorge with the groove features in the oldest rock, to the places that the oral traditions of the Havasupai and the Hopi and the Navajo and the Southern Paiute describe as places that were made, places where water was kept, places that went in from the face of the rock, places from a time before the memory of any living person's grandfather's grandfather. The evidence is there, the anomalies are documented, the traditions are maintained. The investigation has not been done. The canyon is patient. It has been asking the same questions since before there were people here to hear them. And now that there are people here, now that the survey teams have come and gone, and the field notes have been written, and the reports have been archived, and the permits have been denied, and the access restrictions have been maintained, and the oral traditions have been preserved through every institutional pressure that has been brought to bear against them, the questions are the same questions, just more precisely documented, just more extensively corroborated, just more clearly pointing toward the section of the canyon that no one has been allowed to go in and look at properly. The deeper we dig into the Grand Canyon, the stranger it gets. And we are still at the rim, still looking down, still asking. The canyon is 277 miles long, a mile deep, 2 billion years old at the bottom, and in its walls, in the restricted section, in the flagged for follow-up caves, in the side canyons with the cisterns, in the inner gorge with the groove features, in the LiDAR anomalies and the thermal anomalies and the marble canyon photographs and the oral traditions and the unpublished field notes and the archived institutional reports, there is a story that has not yet been fully told. The story is waiting, the evidence is waiting, the investigation is waiting. And if tonight you have spent time in the company of that waiting, in the company of these documented anomalies and institutional silences and oral traditions and private letters and 3-sentence publications and unpublished photographs and filed for later reports, then you have been in the company of something real. Something that the standard account of American history does not yet contain. Something that the evidence has been saying, in its patient and fragmented way, since longer than the institutions that have managed it have existed. The canyon is there. The question is there. The evidence is documented. And tonight, while you sleep, the river is still running at the bottom. The walls are holding the warmth of the day and giving it back slowly into the night air. The Vishnu schist is as dark as it has always been, the oldest surface on this continent, and in the caves of the Redwall limestone and in the restricted corridor and in the places the oral traditions say were made and not formed, whatever is there is as patient as the rock it is in. It has waited this long. It can wait a little longer. One more thing must be said about what this particular canyon means in the broader context of American historical self-understanding. Because the Grand Canyon is not just an archaeological puzzle, it is a national symbol. It is one of the places that the American imagination reaches for when it needs to articulate something about the scale of the natural world and the relative smallness of the human story within it. The canyon is used, culturally, as a reminder of deep time and geological humility, a reminder that the human presence in this landscape is recent and that the landscape itself has a history vastly longer than any human institution or civilization. This cultural use of the canyon, as a symbol of natural grandeur and deep time, has paradoxically served to obscure the specific human history of the canyon itself. Because if the canyon is primarily a symbol of nature's scale relative to human insignificance, then the evidence of sophisticated long-term human activity within it complicates the symbol. A canyon that contains evidence of organized human presence over thousands of years, of karst system management and water infrastructure, and specific cave modification for specific purposes, is a different kind of symbol than a canyon that stands as an example of purely natural geological process. It is a canyon that contains, within its walls, evidence of the human capacity to understand and engage with geological and hydrological systems over extended time periods. That is a different kind of grandeur, and it is one that the standard cultural narrative of the canyon has not incorporated. The standard narrative serves specific interests. A canyon that is primarily a natural wonder belongs, culturally and institutionally, in the domain of geological science and natural heritage management. A canyon that is also a repository of complex pre-Columbian human history belongs in a more complicated domain, one that involves indigenous rights, colonial history, the politics of archaeological research, and the epistemological questions about what counts as valid historical evidence. The first canyon is easier to manage. The second is more honest. The evidence points toward the second. The management has produced the first. And that gap between the evidence and the management, between the honest account and the convenient one, is what has been documented across this entire conversation. The canyon will outlast the gap. The questions will outlast the management. The evidence will outlast the institutional inertia. Let us end where we are most honest. In the uncertainty. The Grand Canyon is one of the most investigated geological formations on the surface of the planet. And yet, in the specific category of evidence we have been examining across this entire account, the evidence of human activity in its caves and walls and side canyons and inner gorge across an extended and incompletely documented period, the investigation has been systematically incomplete. Not by accident, not simply because the work is difficult, though it is, but because the institutional frameworks that have managed the investigation have not been structured to ask the questions that the evidence is raising. This is a structural problem with a structural solution. The solution is not to burn down the institution, it is to change the framework, to incorporate the oral tradition evidence that the framework has excluded, to apply the non-invasive survey methods that the framework has denied, to compile the scattered evidentiary record that the framework has left fragmented, to publish the compiled record in the mainstream literature where it can be engaged with by the broader research community, to review the access restrictions that the framework has maintained without public explanation. These are doable things. They require resources and will and the cooperation of the relevant indigenous communities. They do not require any assumption about what the investigation will find. They require only the recognition that the evidence warrants the investigation, which it clearly does, and the institutional commitment to conduct it, which has not yet materialized. The canyon will be there when that commitment arrives. It has been there for 5 to 6 million years. It is not going anywhere. But the knowledge that can inform the investigation is not equally patient. The oral tradition, preserved through boarding schools and territorial reductions and cultural disruptions, is maintained by human beings who are mortal. The elders who carry the most complete and geographically specific accounts of the canyon's features are not going to be available indefinitely. The traditional knowledge is being transmitted, but the transmission is imperfect, and the demographic pressure on small communities with specific linguistic knowledge is real. The window for incorporating the richest oral tradition evidence into a systematic research program is not unlimited. It is narrowing. This is an additional reason, beyond the purely evidentiary argument, for urgency about the investigation. Not dramatic urgency, not the urgency of a discovery about to be lost to the elements, but the quiet, persistent urgency of knowledge that is in the care of communities under pressure, transmitted through networks that are not guaranteed to remain intact at the level of detail that the investigation would require. The Havasupai community is small. The Hopi community is small. The Southern Paiute communities are small. The knowledge they hold is specific, detailed, and geographically grounded in ways that take generations to develop and that cannot be reconstructed from written sources if the transmission chain is broken. The boarding school period disrupted those chains for a generation. The subsequent period of cultural recovery has restored much but not all of what was disrupted. The opportunity to incorporate the fullest possible version of the traditional knowledge into a systematic research program exists now. It will not exist indefinitely. This is not a dramatic argument. It is a quiet one. The knowledge is there. The people who hold it are willing to share it in appropriate research contexts, as has been demonstrated by the history of collaborative research at other sites where similar methodologies have been applied. The opportunity is open. The investigation has not been conducted. Time is a relevant variable. The canyon does not experience time in the way that any of us do. It has no awareness of the research deficit or the oral tradition transmission pressure or the window of opportunity that is narrowing. It simply continues to be what it is, exactly what it has been for the entire period we have been discussing. but we experience time. And in the experience of time, the gap between what the evidence calls for and what has been done narrows the opportunity even as it widens the record of non-investigation. Each year that passes without the investigation is a year in which the evidentiary window is a year narrower and the record of non-investigation is a year longer. The canyon has been patient on our behalf. The evidence has been patient. The traditions have been patient. The question is whether we are going to be patient enough to let the opportunity close without taking it. The answer is not obvious. The institutional history of the canyon suggests that the opportunity may indeed close without the investigation occurring, as it has in other cases where the evidence pointed towards something the framework was not structured to address. But the institutional history is not determinative. Institutions change. Frameworks expand. The pre-Clovis evidence changed the framework that had been maintained for decades by the same institutional inertia that maintains the non-investigation of the canyon's anomalies. The change was possible. It happened. The framework revision it produced has opened new questions and new research directions across North American archaeology. The canyon's contribution to that broader revision is waiting. The evidence is there. The oral traditions are there. The methods are available. The non-investigation is documented. The access restrictions are maintained. And the window, while narrower than it was a generation ago, is not yet closed. That is where the story of the Grand Canyon's anomalies stands. Not at a dramatic conclusion, at an open question. A question that has been open for over 100 years, and that is supported by a body of documented evidence that makes dismissal increasingly difficult to sustain, and investigation increasingly overdue. The canyon is 277 miles long, a mile deep, 2 billion years old at the bottom. It has been asking its questions for all of that time. We are still at the rim, and the edge is right there, and the walls go down. There is a phrase that appears in the Hopi oral tradition that is preserved in several ethnographic accounts. It appears in different formulations in different sources, but the core meaning is consistent. The phrase describes the canyon as the place where the memory of the world is kept. Not a metaphor for natural beauty, not a reference to the geological record, but a specific claim about the canyon as a repository, a place where something is held, maintained, available to those who know how to access it. What the Hopi tradition says is kept in the canyon is not a physical object. It is knowledge, the memory of how things were before, the understanding of what was done and how it was done and why. The record of a relationship between people and a landscape that extends back to a time the tradition calls the world below, before the emergence, before the surface world as the Hopi currently know it existed in its present form. This is, in the language of indigenous cosmology, a claim about the canyon as the oldest library, not a library of paper and binding and catalogued volumes, but the kind of library that a landscape is when it has been in relationship with a specific human community long enough to hold, in its physical features, the record of that relationship. The canyon holds the memory of the world, in its walls, in its caves, in the specific places that the tradition identifies as made rather than formed. The oral tradition is, in this reading, the catalogue, the specific geographical knowledge of the Havasupai elder who described places where water was kept in specific tributary canyons is an entry in that catalogue. The Hopi emergence narrative is an entry. The Navajo accounts of places where the rock was worked by the ancestors are entries. The Southern Paiute tradition of specific canyon locations associated with activities from before human memory are entries. The physical features in the restricted corridor are the volumes that the entries point to. The worn thresholds and the smoothed walls and the cut floors and the cisterns and the groove features and the thermal anomalies and the rectangular depressions are the actual library. The physical record that the oral tradition has been cataloguing. No one has systematically matched the catalogue to the volumes. The catalogue exists in ethnographic archives and in the living oral traditions of the relevant communities. The volumes exist in the institutional survey records and in the restricted physical features of the Eastern Corridor. The matchup, The systematic cross-referencing of the geographical specifics of the oral tradition with the documented locations of the physical anomalies has not been done. It would be a remarkable exercise, not because the results would necessarily be dramatic, but because the systematic cross-referencing of two independent evidentiary sources, both pointing at the same section of the same landscape from entirely different directions, would produce a combined picture that is significantly more informative than either source alone. That cross-referencing is the investigation that the canyon has been waiting for, not the excavation of the restricted corridor, which would require access that has been denied, not the dramatic find that overturns the standard account in a single headline. The quiet, systematic, interdisciplinary work of matching the catalogue to the volumes, of saying, here is what the oral tradition says is at this location, and here is what the 1,971 cave survey found when it looked at a cave in that section, and here is what the thermal imaging data shows for the wall surface in that area, and here is what the LiDAR analysis noted for that elevation range, and here is what the 1,923 USGS survey documented in that canyon section, and here is what Mays described in the interior spaces he accessed in that part of the canyon. The match, the cross-referencing, the assembled picture, that is the investigation. That is what the evidence has been asking for. That is what the canyon has been waiting for since Powell wrote that some formations asked questions this generation could not answer. The generation he was writing about is long gone. 3 or 4 generations have come and gone since Powell wrote that. The questions are still being asked. The investigation is still waiting to be done. The canyon is patient. We are at the rim. The edge is there. And the walls go down through all of those named formations and all of those unconformities into the old dark of the inner gorge and the old dark of the restricted section and the old dark of the uninvestigated caves, where the questions are waiting in the limestone and the schist for someone to come with the methods and the will, and the open question and actually look. The deeper we dig into the Grand Canyon, the stranger it gets, and the digging has barely begun. The river runs at the bottom. The walls hold the warmth. The stars come out over the rim. The canyon breathes in the way that large spaces breathe when the air moves through them at night. And somewhere in the restricted section, in the caves that have been flagged for follow-up since 1971, in the places that the oral traditions say were made rather than formed, in the features that the surveys have documented and the permits have prevented investigating, the questions that have been asking themselves for over 100 years continue to ask. The canyon is patient. It has been patient for 2 billion years. It will be patient tonight, while you sleep. There is one more figure in this story who deserves mention before we are done. Not a researcher, not an administrator, not an elder whose oral tradition has been preserved in ethnographic archives. A child. In 1947, a Havasupai girl named Lily Weskogame, who was 8 years old at the time, he was accompanying her grandmother into one of the eastern tributary canyons when her grandmother showed her a feature in the canyon wall that the grandmother described as something the old people had made. Lily was not told what it was for. Her grandmother said only that it had been there before anyone alive could remember, and that it was important, and that she should remember where it was. Lily Weskogame remembered. She grew up. She became an elder herself. And in a series of interviews conducted in the 1990s by a researcher documenting Havasupai traditional knowledge, she described the location with the geographic specificity of someone who had held a childhood memory for 50 years. She described the feature her grandmother had shown her. She described where it was in the tributary canyon. She described what it looked like. A modification of the rock face. An opening that had been smoothed at its edges. A depression in the canyon floor in front of it that was too regular to be natural. The location she described is in the eastern corridor. The feature she described matches the descriptions of anomalous cave openings in the institutional survey reports. The interview is in a research archive. It has not been published in the mainstream literature. It has not been cross-referenced with the survey reports. It has not been the basis for a permit application to conduct further investigation at the location she identified. Lily Weskogame is elderly now. The location she described is there. The survey reports documenting features in that section of the canyon are in the institutional archive. The permit for investigation has not been applied for, or if it has been denied without the Wesco game interview as supporting documentation. This is the human version of the fragmentation problem. Not just documents in different archives, people with specific knowledge, specific geographical memory, specific accounts of specific features in specific locations, who are not connected to the research programs that would find their knowledge most useful. The Havasupai traditional knowledge holder who was shown a specific feature by her grandmother in 1947 and remembered the location for the rest of her life. The USGS survey team that documented rectangular depressions in the same general area in 1923. The 1,971 cave survey team that flagged cave openings in the same section for follow-up. Mays who accessed interior spaces in the same area in the 1980s and found cut floors and dressed walls. All of them have a piece of the picture. None of their pieces have been assembled into the whole. And the whole is pointing at a specific section of a specific canyon that has been restricted for administrative reasons that have not been publicly explained. The Wesco game interview is not proof. No individual piece of evidence in this account is proof. The accumulated body of evidence is not yet proof in the strong sense, because the investigation that would produce proof has not been conducted. But the accumulated body of evidence is more than enough to justify the investigation. It has been more than enough for decades. And the human accounts, the childhood memory of a feature shown to a girl in 1947 by a grandmother who said the old people had made it, are among the most specific and geographically precise evidence in the record. The canyon holds its features, the traditions hold their memories, the archives hold their documents, and the investigation holds its absence, persistent and documented across 100 years of evidence that has been asking for it. The edge is there, the walls go down, the questions are waiting. We have been at the rim long enough to know what the evidence says. Long enough to know that the investigation is warranted, long enough to know that it has not been done, long enough to know what would be required to do it. Now the canyon breathes in the night air, large and dark and patient, holding its walls and its caves and its restricted sections and its oral tradition anchors and its archived anomalies and its 2 billion years of geological patience. And you who have been in the company of this evidence through all these hours are somewhere in the world right now, in a specific place and a specific time zone, at some specific hour of the day or night. The canyon is patient, the questions are patient, the evidence is patient, and somewhere in the restricted section of the eastern corridor of the Grand Canyon, in the caves that have been flagged for follow-up since 1971 and never followed up, in the features that Lily Wesco Game's grandmother showed her in 1947, and that she has remembered for her entire life, in the places that 4 separate oral traditions identify as features that were made rather than formed, in the groove features of the oldest rock and the smoothed walls of the Redwall limestone and the cisterns of the side canyons, something that has not yet been properly looked at is still there, still waiting, still patient. The deeper we dig into the Grand Canyon, the stranger it gets. Good night. The canyon is patient. Rest well.